She was 12 years old, bleeding through a torn jacket and hiding under a bench in the rain, begging a stranger not to give her up. The man searching for her drove a convoy of black trucks and wore a smile that made an entire town go quiet. Nobody in Ash Hollow asked questions. Nobody called for help. Because the last person who stood up to Grant Mercer disappeared into the same collapsed mine that swallowed 6 workers and buried the truth beneath 1,000 tons of rock. But tonight, a waitress with nothing left to lose made a choice that would crack this town wide open. And the rumble of motorcycles rolling through the fog? That wasn't coincidence. That was the sound of men who'd been waiting for a reason to stop running from their own ghosts. If this story hits you in the chest, do me a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your city in the comments so I know where you're watching from. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The rain didn't fall on Ash Hollow. It punished it. Sheets of cold water hammered the cracked asphalt of Route 11, turning potholes into black mirrors and flooding the gutters along Main Street until the only sound left was the constant, furious drumming against tin roofs and broken awnings. The mountains surrounding the valley trapped the clouds low, pressing them against the town like a hand smothering a flame. No stars, no moon, just the buzzing yellow glow of a single neon sign that read, Dales. The E flickering every few seconds, as if even the electricity was trying to leave. Nora Quinn stood behind the counter wiping the same mug she'd been wiping for 10 minutes. Not because it was dirty, because her hands needed something to do. The diner was empty except for the coffee machine gurgling its last pot of the night and the low static hiss of a radio no one had bothered to tune. She was 34 and looked 42, dark circles carved beneath gray-green eyes. Hair pulled back so tight it made her temples ache, an apron stained with grease and ketchup and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't wash out. She'd worked the closing shift at Dale's for 3 years, ever since her divorce left her with a rusted Subaru, a rented room above the hardware store, and a silence so heavy she sometimes turned the radio on at 2 a.m. just to hear another human voice. The clock above the pie case read 9:47 p.m. She was about to lock up when she heard it. Not the rain, not the wind rattling the screen door, something underneath all of it. Thin, fractured, barely alive. A whisper. Nora set the mug down and walked toward the front door. The fluorescent light from the diner spilled across the warped wooden porch, catching the edges of an old bench that had sat against the building's exterior wall since before she was born. Peeling green paint, one leg shorter than the others. A memorial to a time when people actually sat outside Dale's and talked to each other. She almost missed it. A small shape pressed against the wall beneath the bench, knees pulled to chest, arms wrapped around something metallic, soaked through, shivering so hard the trembling was visible even in the dim light. Nora crouched down slowly. 2 wide, terrified eyes stared back at her from the shadows. "Please," the voice cracked, a child's voice, a girl's voice. "Don't tell him I'm here." Nora's breath stopped in her throat. The girl was young. 11, maybe 12. Her left leg was twisted at an angle that made Nora's stomach turn, wrapped crudely in what looked like a torn flannel shirt soaked dark with blood and rainwater. Mud covered her arms and face. Her fingernails were broken, packed with dirt as if she'd been crawling through the earth itself. And clutched against her chest, held so tightly her knuckles had gone white, was a rusted metal lunchbox with a faded sticker of a cartoon astronaut peeling off the corner. "Hey," Nora said softly. "Hey, it's okay." "It's not okay." The girl's jaw clenched. Her whole body was shaking, but her eyes were locked, fierce, burning with something far older than her years. "He's coming. He's already here." Before Nora could respond, she heard it. Engines. Not 1, not 2. A low growl building from somewhere up the highway, growing louder, multiplying. Headlights sliced through the rain like searchlights sweeping a prison yard. A convoy of pickup trucks, 4, then 5, then 6, rolled down Main Street in a slow, deliberate formation. Clean trucks. Expensive trucks. The kind nobody in Ash Hollow could afford. They pulled to a stop in front of the old post office, and doors opened simultaneously as if choreographed. Men stepped out. Heavy boots on wet pavement, dark jackets. Flashlights clicking on one after another, beams cutting through the downpour in sharp white lines. And then the lead truck's driver door opened and Grant Mercer stepped into the rain. He didn't hurry, didn't hunch against the cold. He simply stood there for a moment, adjusting the collar of a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Nora earned in 3 months, and surveyed the empty street the way a man surveys property he already owns. Grant Mercer was 56. Silver hair cropped close, clean-shaven jaw that could have been chiseled from the same granite these mountains were made of. He carried himself with the easy authority of a man who'd spent decades making other people's problems disappear, and being thanked for it. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they moved across every window, every doorframe, every shadow with a patience that felt mechanical. He smiled. That was the worst part. The smile. It was warm and practiced and completely empty, the kind of expression a man puts on the way he puts on a watch, because it's expected, because it's useful, because it makes people comfortable long enough to stop asking questions. 2 of his men jogged up to the diner's porch. Nora stood up quickly, blocking the door with her body. Her pulse was hammering against her ribs. "Evening," one of them said. Young, clean-cut, polite in a way that felt rehearsed. "We're looking for a girl, 12 years old, Mr. Mercer's niece. She wandered off from a family gathering up in Ridgecrest, and we're worried she might be hurt." The other man held up a phone with a photograph. A school picture. Neatly combed hair, a forced smile, a background of fake blue sky. The same face that was right now pressed into the dirt beneath the bench 3 feet behind Nora. "Haven't seen anyone," Nora said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Steadier. As if something inside her had already decided. The man with the phone tilted his head slightly. "You sure? Storm like this, a kid might come looking for warmth." "I'm sure." He stared at her for 2 seconds too long, then nodded and stepped off the porch. Nora didn't move until both men had crossed the street. Her hands were trembling. She turned around, crouched back down, and looked under the bench. "Come on," she whispered. The girl didn't move. "I said come on, right now." "Why?" "Because they're going to check again, and next time I won't be enough." Something in Nora's voice, the rawness, the lack of pretense, the sound of a woman who'd spent 3 years learning what it meant to be abandoned and still hadn't found the bottom, broke through the girl's resistance. Slowly, painfully, the child dragged herself out from under the bench, clutching the lunchbox with one arm and reaching for Nora with the other. Nora half carried her through the diner, past the empty booths and the cold coffee machine, past the kitchen with its grease-coated exhaust hood and the mop bucket nobody had emptied. She pulled open the pantry door, a narrow space barely wide enough for a person, lined with canned goods and 5-pound bags of flour, and set the girl down on the floor between a case of ketchup bottles and a stack of napkin packages. "Stay here. Don't make a sound. He'll find me." "Not tonight." Nora closed the pantry door and stood in the kitchen, pressing both palms flat against the stainless steel counter, trying to make her breathing slow down. Her reflection stared back at her from the brushed metal, distorted, stretched, unrecognizable. She thought about calling the sheriff's office. She thought about calling anyone. Then she remembered the last time someone in Ash Hollow called the authorities about Grant Mercer. It was 4 years ago. A foreman named Pete Salinas filed a complaint with the county about unsafe conditions in the Ridgecrest mine. Mercer owned the mineral rights. Mercer owned the extraction contracts. Mercer owned half the county board. Pete Salinas was found dead in his truck 3 weeks later. Carbon monoxide. Ruled accidental. His widow moved to Reno and never spoke to anyone in town again. Nobody filed complaints after that. Nora didn't make any calls. She walked back out to the dining room and began wiping down tables, because if anyone came back, she needed to look like she was closing up, like nothing had changed, like her world hadn't cracked open in the last 6 minutes. 20 minutes passed, then 40. The convoy didn't leave. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see flashlight beams sweeping the alley behind the hardware store, the parking lot behind the Baptist meeting hall, the overgrown lot where the old movie theater used to be. Methodical, patient. They weren't searching like men in a hurry. They were searching like men who were certain. At 10:30, the bell above the diner door jingled. Grant Mercer walked in alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the rain drip off his overcoat onto the scuffed linoleum, and looked around the diner with the amused curiosity of a man visiting a museum exhibit about poverty. Then he walked to the counter, pulled out a stool, and sat down. "Coffee," he said. Not a question, not a request. Nora poured it, set it in front of him. The mug had a small chip on the rim. She noticed his eyes register it, catalog it, dismiss it. "Quiet town," he said. "Always has been. I like that about small places. People look out for each other." He lifted the mug, took a slow sip, set it back down precisely in the center of the saucer. "My niece, Ember. She's been through a lot. Troubled home, psychological issues, the kind of child who invents stories when she's scared." He paused. "Dangerous stories." Nora said nothing. "If someone were to find her, and I imagine someone will, I'd want them to know that she's not reliable, that the things she says aren't rooted in reality, that bringing her home to her family is the only responsible thing to do." His pale eyes lifted from the coffee and settled on Nora's face. Not aggressive, not threatening, just still, the way a predator is still. "I understand," Nora said. "Good." He placed a $100 bill on the counter beside the coffee mug. "For the coffee." He stood, buttoned his overcoat, and walked out. The bell jingled behind him. The sound it made was almost cheerful. Nora stared at the $100 bill. She didn't pick it up. She didn't touch it. She felt like touching it would mean something she couldn't undo. She waited until the convoy pulled away from Main Street, not leaving town, just repositioning, spreading out to cover more ground, before she went back to the pantry. Ember was sitting exactly where Nora had left her, but now the lunchbox was open on her lap. Old photographs, a small leather notebook, and beneath them, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic, a rectangular object the size of a deck of cards. "He's not my uncle," Ember said. Her voice was quiet now, controlled. The voice of a child who had learned very young that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I figured. My dad worked for him, in the mines, the old tunnels under Ridgecrest. They weren't mining coal. They were pulling something else out of the ground. Rare metals, rare earth minerals, something that's worth a lot of money. My dad found out they were cutting corners, skipping safety protocols, hiding inspections. He started keeping records." She touched the leather notebook with her fingertips, gently, the way you touch something that belongs to a ghost. 3 years ago, there was a collapse. 6 men died. My dad wasn't in the mine that day, but he saw what happened. He saw that it wasn't an accident. He saw that Grant's people knew the support beams were failing and sent the crew in anyway because they were 3 days behind on a shipment. "Where's your dad now?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "He told me if anyone ever came looking, I should take the lunchbox and run. He said the box had everything, the proof, the records, the recordings. He said it was the only thing that could stop Grant Mercer." She paused. "He said to trust no one in this town. And yet here you are, trusting me." Ember looked up at her. The fierceness was still there, but beneath it was something else. A bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that settles into a child's face when survival has been their only full-time occupation for as long as they can remember. "You didn't look away," Ember said. "When your eyes found me under the bench, everybody else would have looked away." Nora felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack, the way ice cracks when something warm pushes through from below. She knelt down. "How long has your leg been like that?" 2 days. I fell crossing the ravine above Miller's Creek. I think something's broken." 2 days. This child had been dragging a broken leg through mountain terrain for 2 days, in the rain, alone, clutching a dead man's lunchbox. "We need to get you to a doctor. The clinic in town is closed, has been for a year." "I know." "The nearest hospital's in Cedar Falls, 45 minutes on the highway." "I know that too." "He has men on the highway." Of course he did. Nora sat down on the pantry floor across from the girl, her back against a shelf of canned tomatoes, and pressed her palms against her eyes. She could feel the weight of every decision she'd ever avoided pressing down on her shoulders. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of pouring coffee and pretending Ash Hollow was just a town where nothing happened instead of a town where everything happened in silence. "Okay," she said finally. Okay, we figure this out. She didn't know how, she didn't have a plan, she didn't have money or connections or leverage or courage, at least not the kind she recognized. All she had was a kitchen pantry, a pot of cold coffee, and the absolute certainty that if she opened that front door and handed this girl over, she would spend the rest of her life knowing exactly who she was. And she already knew too well. Nora locked the diner's front door for the first time in months, killed the neon sign, and dragged a heavy flour sack against the kitchen's back exit. She found an old first aid kit behind the register, half empty, the gauze yellowed, the tape barely sticky, and did what she could with Ember's leg. The girl didn't cry, didn't flinch. She just stared at the ceiling and breathed through her teeth, her fingers locked around the lunchbox so tightly the tendons stood out like wires beneath her skin. By midnight, the rain had slowed to a steady, sullen drizzle. The flashlight beams outside had multiplied. Nora could hear doors opening and closing along Main Street. Not the doors of businesses, but the doors of homes. They were going house to house. At 12:15, someone knocked on the diner's front door. Nora stood behind the counter, arms crossed, heart slamming. "Nora, it's Cal. Cal Whitman." Her landlord. 62, retired postman, the kind of man who always brought her mail to the diner instead of leaving it in the box because he liked having an excuse to talk to someone. He was harmless. He was decent. He was also terrified of Grant Mercer. She unlocked the door. Cal stood on the porch in a rain jacket 2 sizes too big, his thin white hair plastered to his skull. His eyes were jumping. "They're at the Braddock place now," he said, going through every room. "Karen Braddock's crying. Her kids are scared." "What do you want me to do about it, Cal?" "I want you to be careful." He lowered his voice. "There's talk. People are saying someone might know where the girl is. People are saying whoever's hiding her is going to get the same thing Pete Salinas got." The name hit Nora like a slap. She felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't break eye contact. "Nobody's hiding anyone, Cal." He stared at her. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Then he nodded slowly, looked down at his boots, and turned away. He stopped at the edge of the porch. "Your kitchen light's on," he said without turning around. "Might want to fix that." Then he was gone. Nora closed the door, locked it again, and leaned her forehead against the cold glass. She could see her reflection overlaid on the dark street outside, and behind her reflection, the faint glow leaking from the kitchen doorway. He knew. Cal knew. He wouldn't say anything. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But he knew, and that meant the circle was already expanding, and circles in Ash Hollow had a way of collapsing inward. She was alone. That was the reality she kept circling back to. A 34-year-old waitress with no allies, no resources, and a 12-year-old girl with a broken leg hiding in her pantry, against a man who could buy the silence of an entire town with a single phone call. The hours crawled. Nora sat on the floor behind the counter with the lights off, listening to the town's fear settle like sediment, trucks moving, boots on pavement, low voices. And beneath it all, from behind the pantry door, the barely audible sound of Ember Hale's breathing, steady, deliberate, the practiced rhythm of a child who had taught herself to sleep lightly because deep sleep could get you killed. At 3:47 a.m., Nora heard something different. Not trucks, not boots, motorcycles. The sound came from the south end of town, low and heavy, a rolling thunder that vibrated in the floorboards and rattled the coffee cups on their hooks. Not the sharp, aggressive scream of sport bikes. This was deeper, slower. The guttural idle of heavy V-twins, the sound of machines built for distance and weight, and the kind of roads that don't appear on maps. Nora moved to the window. 3 motorcycles rolled down Main Street through the drizzle, their headlights cutting low beams through the mist. No formation, no hurry. They moved like animals returning to territory they hadn't visited in a long time, cautious but not afraid. Each bike carried a rider in a dark leather cut, the patches on the back obscured by rain and shadow. They pulled to a stop in front of the vacant lot across from the diner. Engines idled for a moment, then cut, one by one, and the street fell into silence so complete Nora could hear the rain dripping off the awning above her head. The lead rider dismounted. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with broad shoulders that sloped under the weight of something heavier than the leather jacket on his back. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way men move when they've learned that speed attracts attention and attention attracts bullets. His face was half hidden beneath a dark watch cap pulled low, but when he turned toward the diner, the neon glow from the hardware store's security light caught the edge of a jaw mapped with old scars and a pair of eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in years. He didn't come to the door. He just stood there, looking at the diner, looking at the dark windows, looking at the bench where, hours earlier, a terrified girl had pressed herself into the shadows and begged a stranger for mercy. The two men behind him dismounted as well. One was shorter, stocky, with a thick beard and hands that looked like they'd been rebuilt more than once. The other was lean, wiry, moving with the coiled energy of someone who'd spent a lot of time being told to sit still and had never managed it. None of them spoke. Then the tall one reached into the inside pocket of his cut and pulled out a cigarette. He didn't light it, just held it between his fingers, rolling it slowly, and looked at the diner one more time before turning to his men and nodding once. They walked to the bench. The tall one crouched down and touched the ground beneath it. His fingers came up dark. He looked at them for a long time. Blood. He stood up, wiped his hand on his jeans, and finally lit the cigarette. The ember flared orange in the darkness, and for a moment his face was fully visible, weathered, hard, carrying the kind of damage that doesn't come from bar fights or bad luck, but from the specific violence that governments train men to perform and then abandon them to live with afterward. His name was Boone Ryder. He was 41 years old. He was the president of the Steel Reapers MC, a club that operated out of an old machine shop on the outskirts of a town 60 miles south called Iron Creek. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, come home to a family welding business that employed 14 people, and watched it get destroyed in 11 months when Grant Mercer's shell companies undercut every contract, buried every bid, and pressured every supplier until the Ryder family operation was nothing but debt and empty buildings. His father died of a heart attack 6 weeks after filing for bankruptcy. His mother moved in with her sister in Tucson and stopped returning phone calls. His younger brother started drinking and didn't stop until a telephone pole stopped him on a back road outside Flagstaff. Boone didn't drink, didn't rage, didn't file lawsuits he couldn't afford. He just got quiet, the kind of quiet that other men learned to be careful around. He built the Steel Reapers from a handful of veterans who had the same look in their eyes. Men who'd come home to discover that the country they'd bled for had no room for them, no use for their skills, and no patience for the nightmares that jolted them awake at 2 a.m. with their hands already reaching for weapons that weren't there. The club wasn't a gang, it wasn't a criminal enterprise, it was a perimeter, a line drawn in gravel and engine oil that said, "The men inside this circle will not be erased quietly." They ran a bike repair shop, they did custom fabrication, they sponsored a youth boxing program in Iron Creek that kept more kids off the streets than any county initiative ever had. And occasionally, when the world pushed too hard against someone who couldn't push back, they showed up. They showed up. Boone flicked ash into the rain and looked at the blood beneath the bench one more time. He'd heard the rumors 3 hours ago, a frantic call from a woman he'd helped 2 years back, a single mother whose landlord had been threatening eviction until the Reapers showed up and had a conversation that lasted 45 seconds and ended the problem permanently. She'd heard about the search. She'd heard Grant Mercer's name. And she'd called the only number she trusted. "That's a kid's blood," the stocky one said. His name was Dutch. His voice sounded like gravel poured through a diesel engine. "I know what it is. Mercer's trucks are parked up on Ridge Road, 6 of them, maybe more." "I know. So what are we doing?" Boone took a long drag, held it, let the smoke leak out between his teeth. His eyes moved to the diner's front door, to the window, to the faintest crack of light bleeding from somewhere deep inside. "We're waiting," he said. Inside the diner, Nora had pressed herself against the wall beside the window, watching the 3 men through a gap in the blinds. Her hands were shaking again. She didn't know who they were, didn't know what the patches on their backs said. All she knew was that 3 men on motorcycles had appeared at 4 in the morning on the same street where a convoy of mercenaries was hunting a child, and they were standing over the blood the child had left behind. She thought about the pantry, about Ember, about the lunchbox and the leather notebook, and the plastic-wrapped rectangle that might be the only thing standing between a 12-year-old girl and the man who had already buried the truth once beneath a mountain of rock and silence. And then Boone Ryder looked directly at the window where Nora was standing. Not through the glass, not at his own reflection, at her. As if he could see through the blinds, through the dark, through every wall she'd built between herself and the world in the last 3 years. His expression didn't change. He didn't nod, didn't signal, didn't do anything at all except hold her gaze for 5 full seconds with eyes that said something she hadn't heard from anyone in a very long time. "You're not alone in this." Then he turned away, dropped the cigarette, and crushed it under his boot. He said something to his men, too quiet to hear through the glass, and all 3 walked back to their bikes. They didn't start the engines. They just sat there, in the rain, facing the road that led up to Ridge Road, where Grant Mercer's trucks were parked. 3 men on motorcycles, sitting between a child and the darkness coming for her. Nora sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and pressed both hands over her mouth to keep the sound inside. She didn't know if it was relief or terror or something she didn't have a name for. She just knew that for the first time in 3 years, the silence around her felt different. It felt like someone was listening. In the pantry, Ember's eyes were open. She hadn't slept. She was staring at the lunchbox in her lap, at the small leather notebook on top of it, at the handwriting on the first page. Her father's handwriting, tight and careful. The letters slanting slightly to the left the way they always did when he was writing fast, writing scared, writing as if the words themselves might disappear if he didn't pin them down fast enough. The first line read, "If you're reading this, I'm gone, but the truth isn't." She closed the notebook, pressed it against her chest, listened to the sound of motorcycle engines that weren't running but were somehow still present, a vibration, a weight, a promise that the air itself seemed to carry through the walls of the diner and into the narrow darkness of the pantry where a girl with a broken leg held the only thing her father ever gave her that no one could take away. The truth. She didn't know the men outside, didn't know the woman who'd carried her inside, didn't know if morning would bring rescue or ruin, but she knew one thing Grant Mercer didn't. She knew what was on that drive, and when the sun came up over Ash Hollow, if it came up, the whole town was going to know it too. Outside, the rain kept falling. The mountains kept pressing down. And somewhere on Ridge Road, Grant Mercer sat in the cab of his lead truck, phone pressed to his ear, listening to reports from his men as they moved through the town like fingers tightening around a throat. He hadn't found her yet. But the night wasn't over. And Grant Mercer was a patient man. He'd waited 3 years for this. He'd buried miners, bought politicians, erased records, and silenced every voice that ever threatened to speak. One girl with a lunchbox wasn't going to stop him. He was certain of that. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see from Ridge Road, what no amount of money or muscle or silence could have prepared him for, was that 3 scarred men on rain-soaked motorcycles had just drawn a line across Main Street, and the woman inside the diner had already chosen her side. Dawn didn't arrive in Ash Hollow. It seeped, gray and reluctant, like light leaking through a bandage. The rain had thinned to a fine mist that hung between buildings like smoke, turning every surface slick and every breath visible. The mountains were invisible behind the cloud ceiling, and the town sat at the bottom of the valley like something swallowed. Nora hadn't slept. She was sitting on the kitchen floor with her knees drawn up and her back against the industrial refrigerator, listening to its compressor cycle on and off, with a rhythm that had become the only predictable thing in her life in the last 8 hours. The pantry door was closed. Ember was asleep behind it, or pretending to be. The lunchbox was silent. The diner was silent. And somewhere outside, 3 men on motorcycles were still sitting in the rain. At 5:52 a.m., someone knocked on the kitchen's back door. Not the front, the back. The one she'd blocked with a flour sack. The one that opened onto the narrow alley between Dale's and the hardware store, where the dumpsters sat and the stray cats fought over chicken bones every Tuesday night. Nora didn't move. The knock came again. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. A pattern that meant nothing to her but felt deliberate. She stood, wiped her palms on her jeans, and moved the flour sack. She didn't open the door. She pressed her ear against it. "I know you're standing there." A man's voice. Low, unhurried, roughened at the edges like sandpaper dragged across wet concrete. "And I know what you've got in the pantry." Nora's hand went to the knife block on the counter. She pulled out an 8-inch chef's knife and held it along her forearm, blade flat against her skin. Then she opened the door 6 inches. Boone Ryder stood in the alley. He was soaked through, not freshly soaked, but the deep, settled kind of wet that meant he'd been in the rain for hours without seeking cover. Water ran in slow lines down the creases of his leather cut, pooling at the seams where the patches were stitched. His dark watch cap was pulled low, but she could see his eyes clearly now in the gray morning light. They were brown, almost black, and they carried a stillness that was neither calm nor cold, but something in between. The controlled absence of reaction that comes from having seen too much to be surprised by anything, and knowing that surprise is a vulnerability. He looked at the knife. "That's a Wusthof," he said. "Good blade. You're holding it wrong." "I'm holding it fine." "You're holding it for cutting onions. You want to hold it for cutting people, flip it edge out, and keep your thumb on the spine." He said it the way a mechanic would tell someone their tire pressure was low. No threat, no performance, just information. Nora didn't flip the knife. She didn't lower it either. "Who are you?" "My name's Boone. I run a shop out of Iron Creek. I'm here because a woman I helped a couple years back called me and said Grant Mercer was tearing this town apart looking for something he lost." He paused. "Or someone." "What's it to you?" "Mercer destroyed my family's business, bankrupted us through shell companies and rigged contracts. My father died because of him. My brother died because of what my father's death did to him." He said this without inflection, without heat, the way a man recites a fact that has calcified so deep inside him it no longer produces pain, only weight. "So when someone tells me Mercer is hunting a child through the mountains, I ride." "That's not an answer. That's a story." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. The architecture of his face didn't seem built for smiling, but a slight deepening around his eyes, an acknowledgement, as if he'd expected resistance and was quietly satisfied to find it. "The blood under the bench," he said. "That's the girls." I don't know what you're talking about." "You do. And you're about 4 hours away from a very bad situation getting worse, because Mercer's men are going to start their second sweep at daylight, and this time they won't be polite about it. Whatever you're planning, you need help." "I'm not planning anything." "Then she'll be dead by noon." The words hung in the mist between them. Nora felt them land in her chest like a fist, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She'd been running calculations in her head all night, every scenario ending the same way: alone, outnumbered, outmatched, with a child who couldn't walk and evidence she didn't know how to use. She opened the door the rest of the way. Boone stepped inside. He moved through the kitchen the way he moved through everything, slowly, deliberately, his eyes cataloging every exit, every surface, every object that could be a weapon or a barrier. He stopped when he saw the pantry door. "She in there?" "Yes." "How bad is the leg?" "Bad. Needs a hospital. Nearest one's in Cedar Falls." 45 minutes on the highway. Mercer's got it covered." "I know." He stood in the center of the kitchen, water dripping off his boots onto the tile, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he pulled the watch cap off his head and ran a hand through dark hair that was shorter than it should have been. Military short, the kind of cut that becomes a habit long after the uniform comes off. The scars on his jaw were more visible now, a thin white line running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a wider, rougher mark on the right side of his neck that disappeared beneath his collar. "I've got 2 men outside, he said. Dutch and a kid named Sawyer. Dutch did 3 tours, knows combat medicine. Sawyer's fast and stupid, which is useful in the right combination. I've got 4 more in Iron Creek who can be here in 90 minutes if I make a call." "And then what?" "And then we figure out how to get a 12-year-old girl with a broken leg past a private army on a road with no exits." Nora set the knife down on the counter. Not because she trusted him, because holding a knife while trying to think was starting to feel ridiculous. "There might be another way," she said. "The old mining tunnels. They run under the whole valley. The main entrance was sealed after the collapse, but there are ventilation shafts and maintenance access points scattered across the ridge. Some of them come out on the other side of the mountain, past the highway." Boone looked at her. You know the tunnel system? My ex-husband was a mining engineer. Before the drinking got bad, he used to talk about those tunnels like they were a second home. I know the access points. Most of them, anyway. Most isn't all. Most is what I've got. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded once and pulled a phone from inside his cut. It was an old flip phone, scratched and dented, the kind of device that existed before everything became trackable. Dutch, he said into it. Come around back. Bring the med kit. He snapped the phone shut and looked at the pantry door again. I need to see what she's got, he said. She's got a lunchbox full of evidence that could bury Grant Mercer. I need to see it. Nora hesitated. Then she walked to the pantry and opened the door. Ember was awake. She was sitting upright against the back wall, the lunchbox closed on her lap, the leather notebook tucked beneath her left thigh, where it couldn't be taken without her knowing. Her eyes went to Boone immediately, not with fear, but with the sharp, evaluating attention of a prey animal assessing whether a new presence was predator or obstacle. Who's he? She asked Nora without looking away from him. Someone who might be able to help. That's what the social worker said. And the deputy. And the man at the bus station who offered me a ride. Boone crouched down to her level. The motion was slow, controlled, the way someone trained to handle frightened animals would move. He rested his forearms on his knees and let his hands hang loose. Non-threatening, open. What happened with the man at the bus station? He asked. Ember's jaw tightened. He drove me to Grant's office instead of the shelter. How'd you get away? Jumped out at a red light. That's when I hurt my leg the first time. The second time was the ravine. Something moved across Boone's face. Subtle, controlled, visible only in the slight flare of his nostrils and the way his fingers curled once and then deliberately uncurled. Not anger. Something past anger. Something that had learned to be quiet because the alternative was destruction. I'm not going to drive you anywhere, he said. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to take anything that's yours. What I'm going to do is sit between you and the front door until we figure out how to get you somewhere safe. That's all I've got. You decide if it's enough. Ember studied him for a long time. Then she looked at Nora. Nora didn't nod, didn't signal, didn't try to influence. She just stood there. The lunchbox stays with me, Ember said. It stays with you. And I see everything, every plan, every move. Nobody decides things for me without telling me first. Deal. The back door opened and Dutch came in, filling the doorframe with shoulders that seemed designed for a different century. He carried a canvas duffel that clinked with medical supplies. Behind him, Sawyer slipped in like a shadow. Rail-thin, mid-20s, with quick dark eyes and a nervous energy that manifested in the constant movement of his hands, always touching something, adjusting something, as if stillness was a language he'd never learned. Dutch knelt beside Ember without introduction, without pleasantries. He pulled the torn flannel away from her leg with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size and examined the injury with the focused efficiency of a man who'd treated worse in worse places. Tib-fib fracture, he said. Not compound. She's lucky. He looked up at Boone. She needs a real splint, antibiotics, something for the pain, and eventually an OR. How long can she move on it? She shouldn't move on it at all. That's not what I asked. Dutch exhaled through his nose. If I stabilize it right, she can handle short distances. Carried, not walking. But every hour we wait, the swelling gets worse and the bone shifts. We're on a clock. Boone stood and turned to Nora. Those tunnel access points. How far is the nearest one from here? 1/4 mile. Behind the old equipment yard on the east side of town. There's a maintenance shaft that drops about 15 feet into the main ventilation corridor. 15 feet with a kid who can't walk. I said it wasn't perfect. I said it was what I've got. Sawyer, who had been pacing near the door, suddenly stopped. There's movement on Main Street. 2 trucks just pulled in from the north. Everyone went still. Dutch's hands froze over the splint he was building. Ember's fingers tightened on the lunchbox. Nora felt the air in the kitchen change, thicken, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. Boone moved to the window above the kitchen sink and looked out through the gap in the blinds. He stayed there for 10 seconds. When he turned back, his expression hadn't changed, but his voice had dropped half a register. They're setting up a checkpoint at the intersection, both ends of Main Street. They can't do that, Nora said. That's legal. Mercer owns the sheriff. The sheriff's department issued a missing persons alert for a 12-year-old girl matching Ember's description at 11 p.m. last night. Every deputy in the county is cooperating with the search. Those checkpoints are official. Nora stared at him. How do you know that? Because I've watched this man operate for 6 years. He doesn't improvise. He plans. He bought the infrastructure long before he needed it. The sheriff, the county board, the mining commission. They're not accomplices. They're investments. The kitchen fell silent except for Dutch's hands working the splint, tearing medical tape, shaping a section of aluminum from the duffel into a rigid brace. Ember watched him work with the detached focus of someone who had learned to separate her body from her pain. I need to see what's on the drive, Boone said. Ember looked at him, then at Nora. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, weighing, measuring, testing the weight of trust against the cost of betrayal. You said I decide, she said. You decide. She opened the lunchbox slowly, lifted the photographs, 5 of them, curled at the edges, showing mining equipment, tunnel interiors, men in hard hats who didn't know they were being photographed. Beneath them, the leather notebook. And beneath that, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic sheeting sealed with duct tape, the USB drive. My dad recorded meetings, Ember said, for 2 years, audio and video. He had a camera hidden in his hard hat and a voice recorder in his lunch thermos. Every Friday night, he'd copy the files to this drive and write down what they meant in the notebook. She touched the notebook. Names, dates, amounts, which inspectors were paid off, which safety reports were forged, which tunnel supports were removed to save money. The collapse, Boone said. Tunnel 7. The support beams were rotted through. My dad filed a report. Grant's site manager, a man named Lyle Dorsey, shredded it and sent the crew in the next morning. Her voice didn't shake. It was the steadiness of rehearsal, of a story told so many times inside her own head that the words had worn smooth. 6 men went in. None came out. Grant's team sealed the tunnel entrance with concrete before the rescue crews arrived and told the county it was a natural geological event. Insurance paid out. OSHA closed the case in 4 months. And your father? He kept the evidence. He was going to take it to someone, a journalist, a lawyer, someone outside the county. But Grant found out. My dad came home one night, packed a bag, gave me the lunchbox, and told me to go to my aunt's house in Silver Pine. He said he'd come find me when it was safe. When was that? 3 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Sawyer stopped moving. Boone's jaw worked once, twice, the muscles beneath the scarred skin flexing like cables under tension. He didn't ask the obvious question. He didn't need to. 3 years was an answer in itself. 3 years of a father who never came to find his daughter was a story with an ending that didn't need to be spoken. Your aunt in Silver Pine, Nora said quietly. Did you make it there? She was gone. The house was empty. A neighbor said she'd moved but didn't know where. I think Grant got to her first. Ember's voice tightened. The first crack in the armor. I stayed with a family in Cold Junction for a while, then a group home in Evansville. Then I ran when Grant's people showed up asking questions. I've been moving ever since. For 3 years, Dutch said from the floor. He'd stopped working on the splint. His big hands rested on his thighs and his eyes were fixed on the girl with an expression Nora hadn't expected from a man built like a concrete barrier. Something raw and unguarded and furious. 3 years, Ember confirmed. I got good at it. Boone stood up and walked to the far end of the kitchen. He stood with his back to the room, both hands flat on the counter, his head bowed. He stayed that way for nearly a minute. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator cycled on. Outside, an engine idled somewhere on Main Street. When he turned around, something had changed. Not in his expression. That was the same controlled mask it always was. But in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, as if a decision had locked into place somewhere inside him like a round chambering. Sawyer, he said, call Iron Creek. Get me Mace, Pike, Torres, and Hannah. Full ride. Armed for deterrence, not engagement. I want them here before the sun clears the ridge. Sawyer was already pulling his phone. Dutch, Finish the splint and get her mobile. We're not going through the tunnels. Not yet. If Mercer's got checkpoints on both ends of Main Street, he's going to tighten the perimeter by midday. We need to be inside the cordon, not trying to break through it. Inside it? Nora said. Why would we stay inside it? Because running is what he expects. Running puts us on his terrain, highways, back roads, open ground. He's got vehicles, he's got numbers, and he's got a police department doing his legwork. But inside this town, we've got buildings, we've got civilians, and we've got the one thing Grant Mercer can't afford, which is witnesses. Boone looked at her. Mercer's power depends on silence. Every person in this town who keeps quiet is a brick in the wall protecting him. But that wall only holds as long as nobody talks. One crack and the whole thing comes down. These people have been quiet for years. Pete Salinas died for not being quiet. Pete Salinas was alone. We're not. The words landed in the room with a weight that Nora felt in her sternum. She looked at Dutch, who nodded once, at Sawyer, who was already whispering coordinates into his phone, at Ember, who was watching Boone with an expression that was no longer evaluating, but something else. Something Nora recognized because she'd felt it herself 6 hours ago, when a pair of brown eyes looked through a rain-streaked window and said, without words, that she wasn't alone. It was the beginning of trust. Fragile as wet paper, dangerous as a lit fuse. There's a problem, Nora said. Everyone looked at her. Cal Whitman, my landlord. He came by last night. He knows, or suspects. He saw the kitchen light on. He warned me about what happened to Pete Salinas. Is he loyal? He's scared. There's a difference. Boone absorbed this. Scared people talk. Scared people trade information for safety. If Whitman goes to Mercer's men, he won't. Are you sure about that? No? The honesty sat between them like a blade. Boone studied her face for a long moment, then exhaled slowly through his nose. Then we have to move faster than his fear. Dutch finished the splint. It was crude but functional. Aluminum bracing held with medical tape and wrapped in gauze, stabilizing Ember's lower leg from knee to ankle. He gave her 2 ibuprofen from a bottle in the duffel and wrapped a survival blanket around her shoulders. She looked smaller inside it, younger, the fierce animal alertness of the night before, giving way to the simple exhaustion of a child who had been running for 1,000 days. At 6:40 a.m., Boone's phone buzzed. He opened it, listened for 5 seconds, and closed it. Mercer's on the move. He's coming down from Ridge Road. His men are going door to door again. Second sweep, like I said. They've got a list of addresses. This one's on it. How do you know that? Nora demanded. Because I've got a man in Iron Creek who used to work Mercer's security detail. He left 6 months ago after Mercer's people ordered him to plant evidence in a labor dispute. He still has contacts inside. He's the one who called me when the convoy rolled out last night. A man inside. A thread connecting back to the machinery of Grant Mercer's empire. Nora filed this away. It was either the most valuable asset they had or the most dangerous liability. We can't stay here, she said. No. The diner has 1 front door, 1 back door, and windows that face Main Street. If they come through the front, they'll find an empty building and a cold kitchen. Boone turned to Dutch. Can she be carried? Carefully, short distances. The hardware store next door. Does it have a basement? Nora nodded. Storage basement, concrete walls. 1 entrance from inside the store, 1 hatch in the alley that leads to a crawl space. Key? Cal has the key. It's his building. Then we need Cal. Nora felt the ground shift beneath her. Everything was accelerating. The decisions, the stakes, the circle of people who knew. Every person added was another potential fracture, another mouth that fear could pry open. I'll go, she said. Not alone. He won't talk to me if there's a biker standing behind me. Cal's old-fashioned. He doesn't trust people he doesn't know. He doesn't need to trust me. He needs to trust you. He does. That's why I'm going alone. Boone looked at her for a long time. The kitchen light caught the scar on his jaw and turned it silver. His hands were at his sides, loose, open. The hands of a man who had learned that control was the only form of strength that lasted. 5 minutes, he said. If you're not back in 5 minutes, I'm coming through the front. Nora didn't argue. She pulled on her jacket, a thin cotton thing that was completely inadequate for the weather and had been completely inadequate for 3 years but was the only jacket she owned, and went out the back door. The alley was empty. The mist had thickened into fog, reducing visibility to 40 feet. She could hear engines somewhere on Main Street but couldn't see them. She moved quickly along the back wall of the hardware store and up the exterior stairs to Cal's apartment above the shop. She knocked. Waited. Knocked again. The door opened a crack. Cal's face appeared, thinner than it had been last night, the skin around his eyes tight with sleeplessness. He was wearing the same rain jacket. Nora, you shouldn't be here. I need the basement key. What? The storage basement, under the hardware store. I need the key, Cal. He stared at her. The crack in the door didn't widen. They came to my house this morning, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. 2 of Mercer's men. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual last night. They asked about you specifically. Nora's stomach dropped. What did you tell them? I told them you closed up at 10 and went home. I told them I didn't see anything. He paused. I lied for you, Nora. I'm 62 years old, and I've never lied to anyone who scared me, and I lied for you. I know, and I'm asking you to do one more thing. You're asking me to die. That's what you're asking. You know what happened to Pete. Pete was alone, Cal. And you're not? You and a 12-year-old girl against Grant Mercer? It's not just us. Cal's eyes narrowed. The motorcycles. I heard them come in. Who are they? People who have their own reasons to want Mercer stopped. Bikers. He said the word the way people in small towns say it. Loaded with every news story, every stereotype, every late-night movie about leather and violence and lawlessness. You're trusting bikers with this. I'm trusting anyone who shows up, Cal. Because nobody else has. The words hit him like a slap. She saw it in the way his head pulled back slightly, the way his hand tightened on the doorframe. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and the truth of it, the specific, undeniable truth that an entire town had looked away while a man like Mercer operated in plain sight, was the kind of mirror no one wants to stand in front of. He disappeared inside for 15 seconds. When he came back, he held out a single brass key on a frayed piece of twine. Bottom of the stairs, first door on the left, the lock sticks. You have to lift the handle while you turn. Nora took the key. Thank you, Cal. Don't thank me, just don't let them find her. His voice cracked on the last word. He closed the door. Nora made it back to the diner in under 4 minutes. Boone was standing exactly where she'd left him, as if he hadn't moved, as if moving was an admission of doubt. She held up the key. Then we go now, he said. Dutch, take the girl. Sawyer, clear the alley. Dutch lifted Ember from the pantry floor with the practiced care of a man who had carried wounded soldiers through places worse than this. She weighed nothing, 80 pounds, maybe less, folded around the lunchbox she refused to release. The survival blanket crinkled against his chest. Her face pressed against his shoulder, and for one unguarded moment she looked exactly like what she was. A child. Exhausted, terrified, and small enough to be carried by a stranger whose heartbeat she could feel through the leather. They moved through the back door single file. Sawyer first, checking the alley in both directions, then Dutch with Ember, then Nora with the key, then Boone bringing up the rear. The fog swallowed them within seconds. Their boots were silent on the wet concrete. The only sound was the distant idle of engines on Main Street and the muffled thump of Ember's lunchbox against Dutch's chest. The hardware store's basement entrance was a rusted metal hatch set into the alley pavement, covered by a sheet of plywood that hadn't been moved in years. Sawyer pulled it aside. Nora fitted the key into the lock, lifted the handle, and turned. The mechanism resisted, groaned, then gave. The hatch swung open on corroded hinges, revealing a narrow concrete stairway descending into darkness. Boone went down first with a penlight clenched between his teeth, then Dutch, sideways on the narrow stairs, cradling Ember against his chest. Then Nora. Sawyer came last, pulling the plywood back into place and closing the hatch above him. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew and old paint. Concrete walls. a bare bulb hanging from a wire that Boone didn't turn on. Shelving units loaded with boxes of nails, caulk tubes, and discontinued inventory that Cal Whitman had been meaning to clear out for a decade. A workbench against the far wall, a concrete floor with a drain in the center. Dutch set Ember down on a folded tarp and checked her splint. Sawyer crouched by the stairs with his ear turned toward the hatch. Boone stood in the center of the room, pen light off, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Nora sat on an overturned bucket and felt the full weight of the last 12 hours settle onto her shoulders like wet concrete. She was hiding in a basement, with a wounded child, with 3 men she'd met 90 minutes ago, with evidence that could destroy a man powerful enough to own the law itself. And the only way out was through tunnels that might not exist anymore, past a man who had killed before and would kill again. In a town where silence had been the survival strategy for so long that speaking felt like a form of suicide. "Boone," she said. He turned toward her voice in the dark. "If this goes wrong, but if Mercer finds us, what happens to her?" The silence lasted 4 heartbeats. She counted them. "He won't find us." "That's not what I asked." Another silence. Then, from the darkness, his voice, stripped of authority, stripped of strategy, stripped of everything except the raw, unarmored honesty of a man speaking to someone he had no reason to lie to. "If it goes wrong," he said, "I'll make sure she gets out, even if the rest of us don't." Nora nodded in the dark. She didn't know if he could see her. It didn't matter. Upstairs, through the ceiling, through the floor of the hardware store, through the walls and the fog and the suffocating weight of a town choking on its own cowardice, the sound of truck doors slamming echoed down Main Street. Grant Mercer's second sweep had begun, and at that exact moment, 7:04 a.m., according to the watch on Boone Ryder's wrist, Sawyer's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, read the screen, and his face went white. "What?" Boone said. Sawyer looked up. In the thin gray light leaking through the hatch seams, his expression was the expression of a man watching a bridge collapse from the middle of it. "The crew from Iron Creek," he said. "Mace, Pike, Torres, Hannah. They hit Mercer's checkpoint on Route 11 about 8 miles out." He swallowed. "Mercer's people pulled them over. They've got their IDs. They've got the club name. They've got everything." The basement went silent. "Mercer knows we're here," Sawyer said. "He knows who we are, and he knows we're protecting her." Boone didn't move, didn't speak. His hand found the penlight in his pocket, and his thumb rested on the switch without pressing it. In the darkness, his breathing was steady, measured, the breathing of a man who had sat in worse darkness with worse odds and survived by refusing to let panic make decisions that required clarity. But Nora, watching him from 5 feet away, unable to see his face but somehow able to feel the shift in the air around him, knew that something had just changed. They were no longer hiding. They were trapped. And Grant Mercer now had a name, a club, and a reason to stop pretending this was a search. It was a hunt. Nobody spoke for 40 seconds. In a concrete basement with no windows, 40 seconds is a geological age. Nora could hear every breath. Dutch's slow and controlled, Sawyer's thin and rapid, Ember's shallow against the tarp where she lay clutching the lunchbox. Boone's breathing she couldn't hear at all, which was somehow worse. Then he moved, not fast, not panicked. He crossed the basement to the workbench, set both hands flat on its surface, and leaned forward with his head down. In the faint gray light bleeding through the hatch seams, his silhouette looked like a man bracing against a wall that was about to fall on him. "Names," he said. "He's got their names." "All 4, Sawyer confirmed. Mace said they ran the IDs through a system, not a police system, private. Mercer's got his own database, license plates, club affiliations, known associates. They flagged the Steel Reapers patch within 30 seconds. Did they hold them? Let them go. Turned them around. Told them Route 11 was closed for a county emergency and sent them back south. They let them go, Boone repeated. He lifted his head. They didn't arrest them, didn't detain them, just identified them and sent them home. Yeah, because arresting them creates paperwork. Paperwork creates witnesses. Witnesses create problems. Boone turned around. He doesn't want a confrontation. He wants information. He wanted to know who's involved, how deep it goes, and whether we're a club acting alone or connected to something bigger. Now he knows it's just us. 7 guys from Iron Creek. and he knows we're already inside the perimeter. Dutch shifted against the wall. Which means the next move is his. The next move is always his. That's the problem we've had from the start. Boone pulled the watch cap from his back pocket, turned it over in his hands without putting it on. A nervous habit that didn't look nervous because he'd trained every outward expression of anxiety into something that resembled patience. We've been reacting, running, hiding. Every move we've made since last night has been a response to something Mercer did first. He set the checkpoints, we went to the basement, he swept the streets, we moved the girl. He controls the board. So what do? Nora asked. We stop playing his game. That's a nice phrase. What does it actually mean? Boone looked at her. In the half-dark, his eyes caught the seam light and held it. 2 points of dull amber that didn't waver. It means we stop hiding and start making noise. Before anyone could respond, Sawyer's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and his mouth opened, but no sound came out for a moment. Then he turned the phone toward Boone. It's from the contact, the guy inside Mercer's operation. Boone took the phone, read the message. His face didn't change, but his thumb pressed hard enough against the phone's edge to turn the nail white. What does it say? Dutch asked. Boone handed the phone back to Sawyer without answering. He walked to the far end of the basement, past the shelving units, past the boxes of discontinued inventory, to the concrete wall where a water pipe ran from floor to ceiling with a slow drip at the joint. He stood there with his back to the room. Boone, Dutch said. Not a question. A warning. The tone of a man who'd served beside another man long enough to recognize the specific quality of silence that precedes either violence or collapse. Mercer's offering a bounty, Boone said. His voice was flat, mechanical. The voice of a man reading a verdict. $50,000, cash. To anyone in Ash Hollow who provides information leading to the girl's location. He paused. And he's giving them until noon. The number hung in the darkness like a held breath. $50,000. In a town where the median income hadn't cleared $30,000 in a decade. In a town where the mine closure had gutted every business on Main Street. In a town where people skipped meals at the end of the month and drove 45 minutes to Cedar Falls for medical care because the local clinic had closed. $50,000 was a new roof, a paid-off truck, a year of breathing room, a reason to pick up the phone and whisper a location to the men in clean pickup trucks. Every person in this town knows we're here, Nora said. She felt the words leave her mouth and heard how they sounded. Not panicked, not angry, just the quiet arithmetic of a woman calculating the weight of human nature against the fragile structure of loyalty. They heard the motorcycles come in at 4 a.m. They've seen the bikes parked on the street. Some of them watched us through their windows. Cal knows. His neighbors know. The woman across from the post office who never sleeps. She knows. Then we have until noon, Boone said. We don't have until noon. We have until someone gets desperate enough to make a phone call. That could be 10 minutes from now. Boone turned around. Whatever he'd been processing at the wall was finished. The flatness was gone from his voice, replaced by something sharper. The focused edge of a man who had accepted the worst-case scenario and was now building strategy on top of it instead of beneath it. Dutch, how many buildings in this town have basements? I don't know, dozen, maybe. Nora? More than that. Most of the buildings on Main Street were built in the 40s for the mining crews. Full basements were standard. Hardware store, the old barber shop, the feed store, the meeting hall. Can they be connected? What? The basements, underground, crawl spaces, utility tunnels, drainage lines. Anything that connects one building to another below street level. Nora thought. She thought about the years she'd spent in this town, the conversations she'd half listened to, the complaints about flooding and foundation cracks and the old drainage system that the county had never upgraded. There's a storm drain, she said slowly, a concrete culvert that runs under Main Street. It was part of the original mining infrastructure, runoff management from the processing operations up the hill. It connects to the drainage systems of at least 4 or 5 buildings along the east side of the street. Big enough for a person? Big enough for my ex-husband to crawl through when he was checking foundation damage after the flood in 2019. So yes, for an adult on hands and knees, maybe. Boone looked at Dutch. Dutch looked at Ember. Ember was sitting upright on the tarp, the survival blanket fallen around her waist, listening to every word with the focused intensity of a child who understood that the conversation happening above her head was a conversation about whether she lived or died. "I can't crawl," she said. "My leg." "You won't have to crawl," Dutch said. "I'll carry you." "Through a storm drain?" "I've carried men through drainage pipes in Helmand province that were half this size and full of things a lot worse than rainwater. You'll be fine." The way he said it, matter of fact, almost bored, pulled something loose inside the room. Not confidence exactly, more like the absence of despair. The recognition that the man sitting on the floor next to a 12-year-old girl with a broken leg had, in fact, been in worse situations and survived them through the specific combination of stubbornness and competence that the military either builds into a person or burns out of them entirely. Boone was about to speak when his phone buzzed. The flip phone, the old one. He opened it and pressed it to his ear without saying hello. He listened for 11 seconds. His face went through something Nora couldn't read. A micro-expression that started as confusion, hardened into recognition, and then settled into something cold and still and terrible. He closed the phone. "Dutch, Sawyer, outside, now." His voice had changed, not louder, quieter, the kind of quiet that precedes detonation. Dutch looked at him. The two men held eye contact for 3 seconds. A conversation conducted entirely in the language of shared history, shared combat, shared trust. Then Dutch rose, leaving Ember on the tarp, and followed Boone up the stairs. Sawyer went last. The hatch opened. Gray light spilled down, then it closed, and Nora and Ember were alone in the dark. Nora waited, listened. She could hear muffled voices above, not the words, just the cadence. Boone's low and steady. Dutch's rougher, rising once, then dropping. Sawyer said something sharp and fast. Then silence. 3 minutes passed. The hatch opened again. Boone came down alone. His boots hit each step with the deliberate precision of a man measuring his own control. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Nora, then at Ember. "I need to ask you something," he said to the girl. "And I need the truth. Not what you think I want to hear, not what's safe, the truth." Ember's hands tightened on the lunchbox. "Okay." "Your father's name." "David Hale." "Yes." "The contact I have inside Mercer's operation. The man who left 6 months ago. His name is Ray Sutter. He was head of Mercer's private security team for 4 years before he walked away." Boone paused. Every word was measured, placed, like a man setting charges. "Ray just told me something he's never told me before. Something he says he couldn't tell me until he knew why Mercer was really hunting you." Nora felt the temperature in the basement drop, not literally. The concrete was the same damp cold it had been all morning, but something in the air changed, the way barometric pressure changes before a storm front, invisible but felt in the teeth and the fingertips. "Ray was on Mercer's security team when Tunnel 7 collapsed," Boone said. "He wasn't at the mine that day, but he handled the aftermath. The cleanup, the containment, the silencing." He looked at Ember, and his voice became something Nora had never heard from him. Careful, gentle almost, the voice of a man who knows he's about to break something that can't be unbroken. "Your father didn't disappear, Ember." The girl stopped breathing. "Ray says Mercer's team intercepted your father 3 days after he gave you the lunchbox. They picked him up on the highway outside Silver Pine. He was driving to your aunt's house. He had copies of the evidence, a second set he'd made as a backup." "Where is he?" Ember's voice was barely human. It was the sound of 3 years of desperate, irrational, midnight hope being compressed into 2 words. Boone crouched down to her level. He didn't touch her. He didn't reach out. He just brought his face level with hers and let her see his eyes without obstruction. They took him to a private facility outside Ridgecrest, a building on Mercer's property that doesn't appear on any map. Ray says your father was held there for 9 weeks. They wanted the evidence, all of it, every copy, every record. He wouldn't give it up. He told them his daughter had the originals, and he'd rather die than tell them where she was. "Is he alive?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound Nora had ever heard. "Ray doesn't know," Boone said. After 9 weeks, your father was moved. Ray doesn't know where. He says Mercer brought in outside contractors, people Ray had never seen before, and the entire operation was compartmentalized. Ray was told the situation had been resolved, and that's the last he heard. Resolved. Ember said the word like it was made of glass, and she was testing whether it would cut her. That was 3 years ago. Ray doesn't know if your father is alive or dead. What he does know is that the facility still exists, and he knows that Mercer's reason for hunting you isn't just the evidence. Nora's blood went cold. What do you mean, not just the evidence? Boone stood up, his knees cracked. He looked older than 41 in the basement light, older and heavier, as if the information he was carrying had physical mass. Ray says Mercer already has copies of most of the financial records. His lawyers have been building defenses against them for years. Manufactured alibis, destroyed servers, paid witnesses who'll testify the documents are forgeries. The recordings are harder to counter, but he's got voice authentication experts on retainer who'll challenge them. He paused. The one thing he can't neutralize is David Hale himself, a living witness, a man who was inside the operation, who saw the collapse, who can testify under oath about what happened in Tunnel 7. You just said you don't know if he's alive, Nora said. I don't. But Mercer doesn't either. Boone let that sit. Ray says that's why the hunt escalated. 2 weeks ago, Mercer received information, Ray doesn't know from where, suggesting that David Hale may have survived, that he may have escaped or been released by one of the outside contractors who had second thoughts, that he may be trying to make contact with his daughter. The basement was silent. Absolutely, completely, impossibly silent. Even the drip from the pipe joint had stopped, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Ember's face had gone white. Not pale. White. The blood had drained from her skin so completely that the bruises on her cheekbones stood out like ink stains on paper. Her fingers on the lunchbox were trembling. Not the exhausted trembling of the night before, but a deep, structural shaking, the kind that comes from the tectonic plates of a person's entire reality, shifting beneath them. He might be alive, she whispered. He might be. And Grant is hunting me because he thinks my dad might come find me. Yes. I'm bait. The word came out of her mouth with a flatness that made Nora's chest seize. 12 years old, sitting on a tarp in a cold basement with a broken leg, clutching the last thing her father ever gave her. And the realization landing on her like a collapsing ceiling, she wasn't being hunted for what she carried. She was being hunted for who she might lead them to. Nora stood up from the bucket and walked to where Boone was standing. She lowered her voice but didn't whisper. Ember would hear anyway, and Ember had earned the right to hear everything. If this is true, if Mercer is using her to draw out her father, then we can't just get her to safety. We'd be leading them straight to David. If David's alive. If David's alive. And if he's trying to find her. That's a lot of ifs. One of those ifs is a child's father. One of those ifs is the only living witness to 6 murders. Nora's voice hardened. Those ifs matter. Boone looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not softening, not weakening, but recalibrating. The way a man looks at someone he'd been mentally categorizing as a civilian and suddenly isn't sure the category fits anymore. Yes, he said. They do. The hatch opened above them. Dutch's face appeared, backlit by gray fog. We've got a problem up here. Another one? Cal Whitman is standing in the alley. He looks like he's about to have a heart attack. And there's a woman with him. Nora climbed the stairs. The alley was thick with fog, cold and wet, the kind that soaks through clothing in seconds and settles into bone. Cal stood 6 feet from the hatch, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his rain jacket, his face the color of old ash. Beside him was a woman Nora recognized, Karen Braddock, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a fleece pullover and the expression of someone who'd made a decision they couldn't unmake. Karen, Nora said. He offered $50,000. Karen's voice was controlled, but underneath it Nora could hear the grinding plates of fear and conscience colliding. My neighbor Donna heard it from one of Mercer's men at 7 this morning. $50,000 for the girl's location. Donna's already thinking about it. She's got 2 kids, and her husband left in March, and she's 3 months behind on the mortgage. Is she going to call? I don't know. That's why I'm here. Karen looked at the hatch, at Dutch standing guard beside it, at the leather cut and the patches and the big scarred hands. She looked back at Nora. I came to warn you, but I also came because I need to know. Is this real? Is there actually something that can stop him? Because if this is just running, if you're just hiding until he finds you and makes you disappear like Pete Salinas, then I can't be part of it. I have children. Nora felt the weight of the question like a physical pressure against her sternum. She thought about the lunchbox, the drive, the recordings, the possibility, fragile, unconfirmed, maybe illusory, that David Hale was still alive. It's real, she said. There's evidence, financial records, audio recordings, video, enough to bury Mercer in federal court. Then why hasn't anyone used it? Because the only person who had it was 12 years old and running for her life. Karen stared at her. Her jaw worked. Her eyes glistened and she blinked it away with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd learned that crying was a luxury reserved for people whose problems were smaller. Donna won't wait long, Karen said. If she calls, Mercer's men will be at this building in 10 minutes. And she's not the only one thinking about it. Half this town is doing the same math right now, $50,000 against the life of a girl they've never met. They know, Cal said quietly. Everyone knows the girl is somewhere near the diner. The motorcycles, the lights last night. This town is too small for secrets, Nora. It always has been. Nora turned to Boone, who had climbed up behind her and was standing in the hatch opening, his upper body in the fog, his legs still on the stairs. How long to reach the storm drain entrance from here? He asked. The nearest access point is in the basement of the old barber shop, 2 buildings east. Can we get there without going above ground? No. The utility connection between this building and the barber shop was sealed during the renovation in 2012. We'd have to go through the alley that's visible from Main Street. Yes. Boone pulled himself out of the hatch and stood in the fog. He lit a cigarette. The same deliberate ritual, the same unhurried hands, as if the act of smoking was a form of meditation that allowed his mind to work at a speed his body refused to betray. He took 2 drags, exhaled into the mist, and looked at Karen Braddock. How many people in this town would stand with us if they knew the truth? Stand with you? Against Grant Mercer? Karen almost laughed. A month ago I would have said none, but a month ago nobody was offering $50,000 for a child. That changes things. That makes people think about what kind of town they're living in. That's not an answer. 5, maybe 8. People who lost someone in the collapse. People who remember what this town was like before Mercer bought everything that wasn't nailed down and ripped up everything that was. She paused. But they're scared. Scared people need more than evidence. They need to see someone stand up first. Boone smoked in silence for a moment. Then he dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and looked at Nora with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not strategic, not calculating, but asking, genuinely asking. The emergency radio tower, he said. The one on the hill behind the processing plant. Is it still functional? The mining communications tower? It hasn't been used since the mine closed. The county was supposed to decommission it, but never did. It's connected to the old emergency broadcast system, the one that feeds into the speakers on Main Street and the public address system in every building that was part of the mining operation. Every building. Every building that still has the original wiring. The diner, the hardware store, the meeting hall, the old company houses on the east side. When the mine was operational, they used it for emergency evacuations. One broadcast would reach every speaker simultaneously. Boone's eyes changed. Not brighter, harder, more focused, the way a lens tightens when it finds its target. If we broadcast the recordings from that tower, he said, every building in Ash Hollow hears them at the same time. Mercer's own voice, Nora said. The understanding hit her like a train. Coming out of every speaker, his own words, his own confessions, in front of every person in town simultaneously. No way to deny it, no way to spin it, no way to claim the evidence is fabricated when the entire town hears him speaking. And once it's public, once hundreds of people have heard it, there's no putting it back. No amount of lawyers or paid witnesses or destroyed servers can unring that bell. Karen Braddock stared at them both. Her mouth was slightly open. Cal had taken a step back, his hand on the brick wall as if he needed it for support. "You're insane," Cal said. "Probably," Boone said. "The processing plant is 1.5 miles from here, uphill, through territory Mercer controls, with a child who can't walk and half the town ready to sell you out for mortgage money." "I know." "And the radio tower, but even if it works, you'd need someone who knows the broadcast system. Someone who can operate the transmitter, patch into the emergency frequency, and override whatever lockouts the county put in place when they shut it down." "I know that too." Cal opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I was the postmaster in this town for 31 years, he said. "Before that, I was a communications specialist in the National Guard. I maintained the mining broadcast system as a county contractor for 6 years after the mine closed because nobody else knew how." His voice was shaking, but his eyes were steady. "I can operate that transmitter." The fog shifted around them. Somewhere on Main Street, a truck door slammed. Voices carried through the mist, clipped, professional, the voices of men executing a search pattern with mechanical efficiency. Boone looked at Cal for a long time. Then he extended his hand. Not a handshake, an open palm, fingers loose. The gesture of a man offering something without demanding anything in return. Cal looked at the hand, looked at the leather cut, looked at the scars and the patches and everything they represented, every assumption, every prejudice, every late-night news segment about violence and crime and the dangerous men who lived outside the lines of respectable society. Then he took it. Their hands clasped once, firm, brief, the sound of leather against weathered skin. "Karen," Boone said, "those 5 or 8 people you mentioned, we need them. Not to fight, not to put themselves in danger, just to keep their eyes open and their phones ready. If Mercer moves, we need to know before he gets there. I'll talk to them. Don't use names, don't use phones, face-to-face only." She nodded and disappeared into the fog without another word. Boone turned to Nora. The fog curled between them, cold and alive. "This changes the plan completely," he said. "We're not running. We're not hiding. We're going to the processing plant, and we're going to put that recording on every speaker in this valley. With 6 men, a waitress, a retired postman, and a 12-year-old girl with a broken leg." "7, Dutch said from the hatch. "You forgot Sawyer." "Sawyer counts as half," Boone said. It was the closest thing to humor Nora had heard from him, and it lasted exactly 1 second before the weight of everything settled back onto his shoulders. "We move at dusk. The fog gives us cover, but Mercer's men have thermal optics. Dutch spotted them scanning the alley from the roof of the post office 20 minutes ago. Once the sun drops behind the ridge, the temperature differential between body heat and ambient decreases. Harder to pick us up." "That's 10 hours from now," Nora said. "I know." "Donna could call any minute." "I know." "And if Mercer's people come through that door before dusk, then we improvise." Boone looked at the hatch, at the basement below, at the invisible girl clutching a dead man's lunchbox in the darkness. "We've been improvising since 4 a.m. We're getting good at it." He wasn't wrong, but Nora knew, and she suspected he knew, that improvisation had a shelf life. Eventually, the variables outpaced the capacity to adapt, and what had felt like agility became nothing more than controlled falling. She went back down into the basement. Ember was sitting exactly where she'd been, but something had changed in her face. The white shock of the revelation about her father had given way to something else. A set to her jaw, a focus in her eyes. The look of a child who had just been told that the worst thing she feared might not be the worst thing at all. That there was something beyond the worst thing. That somewhere in the darkness past the end of hope, there might be a door she hadn't known existed. "If he's alive," Ember said, "then everything changes." "Yes." "If he's alive, then I'm not just carrying evidence. I'm carrying the reason they didn't kill him. He didn't give me up. 3 years and he didn't tell them where I was. He didn't tell them about the lunchbox." Her voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, not the cinematic crack of a child actor performing grief. It broke the way real things break. Quietly, unevenly, with a sound like a branch giving way under weight it was never designed to carry. She pressed the lunchbox against her chest, and her shoulders folded inward, and for 30 seconds she didn't make a sound. She just shook. Silently. Violently. the way a person shakes when the thing they're feeling is too large for the body that contains it. Nora sat down beside her on the tarp. She didn't touch her, didn't hold her, didn't say it was going to be okay, because Nora Quinn had spent 3 years learning that those words were the emptiest currency in the English language, and she refused to spend them on a child who deserved better than comfortable lies. She just sat there, present, close enough that Ember could feel the warmth of another body, close enough that the darkness of the basement had one less square foot of emptiness in it. After a while, Ember's breathing steadied. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a rough, impatient gesture, angry at herself for the tears, and looked at Nora. "The processing plant," she said. "The radio tower. I heard everything. I know. It's a good plan. It's a desperate plan. Desperate is what we've got." The fierceness was back, harder now, tempered by something that had been soft an hour ago and would never be soft again. "I want to go. I want to be there when his voice comes through those speakers. I want this whole town to hear what he did." "You will be." Above them, through the concrete ceiling, through the floor of the hardware store, through the walls and the fog and the miles of silence that had kept Ash Hollow prisoner for years, the sound of truck engines grew louder. Doors opened and closed. Boots struck pavement in patterns that were no longer searching but positioning. The slow, methodical tightening of a net around a town that had forgotten how to resist. And somewhere in the fog, Karen Braddock was walking from door to door, speaking in whispers, looking into the faces of people who had spent years looking away, and asking them a question that had no safe answer. When his voice comes through those speakers, whose side will you be on? The clock above Cal's workbench in the hardware store, visible through the basement ceiling hatch when the light hit it right, read 7:38 a.m. They had 10 hours until dusk. 10 hours to survive a bounty, a betrayal, and a man who had buried the truth once before and would do anything, pay anything, destroy anything, kill anything, to bury it again. In the basement, Boone Ryder sat on the bottom step with his back against the concrete wall and his eyes closed. He wasn't sleeping. He was doing something he'd learned in a forward operating base in Kandahar province when the incoming fire was too heavy to move and too sustained to outlast. He was breathing, counting each inhale, holding it, releasing it in a slow stream through his teeth, a technique taught to him by a combat psychologist who was killed by a roadside explosive device 2 weeks after their last session. He thought about his father, the way the old man's hands looked gripping a welding torch, steady, certain, the hands of a man who built things that lasted. He thought about his brother, the phone call at 3 a.m., the voice of a highway patrol officer who sounded bored, as if death on a back road was just another form to fill out. He thought about Grant Mercer, about the specific architecture of a man who could order 6 workers into a tunnel he knew would kill them and then sit down to dinner. And he thought about the 12-year-old girl sitting 6 feet away from him in the dark, holding a rusted lunchbox that contained the last act of love her father had ever performed. The choice to protect his daughter's location even when protection meant his own destruction. Boone opened his eyes. "When it gets dark," he said to no one and everyone, "we go up the hill, all of us, together, and we don't stop until every speaker in this valley is screaming the truth." The basement said nothing back, but the silence felt different now. It didn't feel like hiding. It felt like loading. Dusk didn't fall on Ash Hollow. It bled, a slow hemorrhage of gray light draining from the sky as the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the valley filled with shadows that moved like water rising in a well. The fog had thickened through the afternoon into something almost solid, clinging to buildings and vehicles, and the faces of the men positioned at both ends of Main Street with the patient stillness of predators who know their prey has nowhere left to go. They had survived the day. Barely. At 11:15 a.m., Donna Kessler had picked up her phone. Karen Braddock saw her through the kitchen window, standing in her living room with the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gripping the countertop. Her face twisted between the weight of $50,000 and whatever remained of her conscience. Karen walked across the street, knocked on Donna's door, and stood in her hallway for 9 minutes. Nobody knew what she said. When she came out, Donna's phone was on the table and Donna was sitting on her couch with her hands over her face. She didn't make the call, but three others did. At 12:40, Mercer's men converged on the old barber shop, the building where the storm drain access point was. They went through it top to bottom, tore up floorboards, smashed through drywall. Found nothing, because Boone had never moved them there. He'd talked about it loud enough for the sound to carry through walls he knew were thin, and then he'd kept everyone exactly where they were. At 2:15, a second team hit the feed store on the west end of Main Street, another empty building, another dead end. At 4:30, they came to the hardware store itself. Two men, professional, efficient, wearing the bored expressions of soldiers executing a routine sweep. They walked through the retail floor, checked the storeroom, looked behind every shelf. Cal Whitman met them at the door with a ring of keys and the performance of a lifetime. The trembling, cooperative, terrified old man who wanted nothing more than to help and had nothing to hide. He led them through every room, opened every closet, showed them the stairs to his apartment. He did not show them the basement. The hatch was in the alley, covered by plywood and 6 inches of standing water from the afternoon rain. The men looked at it, decided it was a drainage grate, and moved on. In the basement, 7 people had spent 10 hours in near-total darkness, breathing recycled air and listening to their own heartbeats. Boone hadn't spoken since noon except to give 2 instructions: conserve water and stay off phones. Dutch had changed Ember's bandage twice and administered the last of the ibuprofen. Sawyer had paced the length of the basement, 14 steps, so many times that Nora could track his position by the sound of his boots without opening her eyes. Now it was 6:47 p.m., and the light bleeding through the hatch seams had gone from gray to purple to nothing. Boone stood up. The sound of his knees cracking was the loudest noise in the basement. It's time. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Dutch lifted Ember from the tarp, the same practiced motion, the same careful hands, and settled her against his chest. She'd been silent for most of the day, conserving energy the way small animals conserve energy, shrinking into herself to reduce the surface area available to pain and fear. But when Dutch picked her up, her hand found the collar of his leather cut and gripped it with a strength that surprised him. "I'm okay," she said. "I know. I'm not going to slow you down. You couldn't if you tried." Sawyer went up the stairs first. He lifted the hatch 2 inches, scanned the alley in both directions, and pushed it open. The night air hit them like a wall, cold, wet, carrying the mineral smell of mountain fog and the distant petroleum scent of idling diesel engines. The plan was simple, because complicated plans require resources they didn't have. Cal would lead them through the back alleys to the east edge of town, where the terrain rose steeply toward the abandoned processing plant. The plant sat on a shelf of cleared land 1.5 miles above Main Street, connected by an old access road that switched back through pine forest and scree. The radio tower was on the roof, a 60-foot steel lattice structure with a broadcast antenna that had been the nervous system of the mining operations emergency communication network. Cal carried a canvas bag containing tools he'd retrieved from his apartment during the sweep. Wire strippers, a soldering iron powered by a butane cartridge, a voltage meter, and a hand-drawn schematic of the broadcast system he'd kept in a filing cabinet for 12 years because throwing things away felt like admitting they were over. Boone led. Nora walked beside Cal. Dutch carried Ember. Sawyer brought up the rear, moving backward every few steps, watching the fog behind them for lights or motion. They made it 3 blocks before the first problem. The alley behind the post office was blocked. A pickup truck, one of Mercer's, sat perpendicular across the passage with its engine off and its parking lights glowing orange through the mist. 2 men sat inside. The cab light was on. They were eating sandwiches. Boone held up a fist. Everyone stopped. He studied the truck for 15 seconds. Then he turned and pointed east. A narrow gap between the post office and the adjacent building, barely wide enough for a person to pass sideways. Dutch looked at it, looked at Ember in his arms, and turned sideways without a word. They squeezed through single file, leather scraping against brick, the sound absorbed by the fog and the distant hum of generators that Mercer's teams had set up at the checkpoints. They emerged on a residential street, small houses, chain-link fences, dead lawns, dark windows. The kind of neighborhood that goes to bed early because there's nothing to stay up for. A dog barked, then another. The sound carried through the fog like gunshots. Boone increased the pace, not running, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who knows the difference between speed and haste and understands that one saves you while the other kills you. At the edge of town, the pavement ended and the access road began, cracked asphalt giving way to gravel, then to packed dirt, then to the steep switchbacks that climbed through stands of pine and Douglas fir into the darkness above. The fog was thinner here, shredded by altitude, and for the first time in 24 hours, Nora could see stars through the breaks in the cloud ceiling. The climb was brutal. Dutch carried Ember without complaint, but Nora could see the toll, the sweat darkening the back of his leather cut despite the cold, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables, his breathing controlled but heavy. Cal struggled. 62 years old, carrying a bag of tools, climbing a grade that would challenge a man half his age. Twice he stumbled and Sawyer caught his arm without comment, without judgment, steadying him the way you'd steady a piece of equipment that was essential to the mission. Boone set the pace, never stopping, never slowing, but adjusting his stride to match the weakest member of the group without making it obvious. A skill learned in places where leaving someone behind wasn't an option, because the people behind you were worse than the mountain ahead. At 7:35 p.m., they reached the processing plant. It loomed out of the fog like the skeleton of something enormous. Concrete and steel, catwalks and conveyor housings, loading docks and ore crushers, and the rusted shells of machinery that had been obsolete for a decade. The main building was 3 stories tall, its windows broken, its walls streaked with rust and mineral stains that looked like dried blood in the darkness. The access road ended at a chain-link gate that hung open on one hinge, and beyond it, a parking lot full of weeds growing through cracked concrete. Above everything, rising from the flat roof of the main building like a metal spine, the radio tower. 60 feet of lattice steel, anchored by guy wires to concrete pads at the building's corners. The broadcast antenna at the top was a horizontal array, 3 aluminum elements mounted on a crossbar, designed to push signal across the valley with enough power to reach every receiver within 5 miles. Cal looked up at it. His face was flushed from the climb, his breath coming in ragged pulls, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there in the basement. Purpose. The specific, focused energy of a man who has spent years feeling useless and has just been handed the one task his entire life prepared him for. "I need to get to the transmitter room," he said. "Top floor, northwest corner. That's where the broadcast equipment is. If the county didn't strip it when they decommissioned—" "They didn't," Nora said. "My ex checked 3 years ago when the county talked about reactivating it for wildfire alerts. The equipment's still there. They just pulled the power feeds." "I can bypass that. The transmitter runs on a 12-volt system with a step-up transformer. I can power it from a car battery if I have to." "There's no car battery up here." Cal opened his canvas bag and pulled out 2 objects, a heavy rechargeable battery pack, the kind used for portable welding, and a tangle of alligator clips and copper wire. "There is now." Boone looked at him with something approaching admiration. Brief, controlled, but present. They entered the plant through a loading dock on the east side. The interior was cavernous, dark, filled with the smell of rust and standing water and the particular silence of large spaces that were built for noise and have forgotten what it sounds like. Boone used his penlight sparingly, quick sweeps to map the floor, identify obstacles, find staircases. The main stairwell was intact but treacherous, metal grating slick with moisture, handrails corroded to the point of uselessness. They climbed single file. First floor, second floor, third floor. The transmitter room was at the end of a corridor lined with doors that hung open on broken hinges, revealing offices stripped of furniture, their walls covered with water stains and the ghosts of removed equipment. The transmitter room itself was exactly as Cal had described, a 10 by 15-foot space dominated by a metal rack holding the broadcast transmitter, a rectangular steel chassis the size of a filing cabinet, its face covered with dials and switches and patch panels that looked like artifacts from another century. A thick coaxial cable ran from the back of the transmitter through a conduit in the ceiling and up to the antenna on the roof. Cal set down his bag and went to work. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 30 years, checking connections, testing circuits with the voltage meter, stripping wires with quick, efficient motions that were completely at odds with the trembling uncertainty he displayed the entire day. Here, in front of this equipment, he was someone else, someone competent, someone essential. 20 minutes, he said. Maybe less. I need to bypass the main power relay, patch the battery into the step-up transformer, and recalibrate the frequency to the emergency broadcast band. Once I'm on frequency, every receiver in the valley that's still wired into the mining communication network will pick up the signal automatically. The speakers, Nora said, are they still active? They're passive. They receive whatever's broadcast on the emergency frequency. If the wiring hasn't been cut, and there's no reason anyone would have cut it, they'll activate the moment I transmit. Boone positioned Sawyer at the stairwell entrance on the ground floor, and Dutch at the third-floor corridor junction. Ember was placed against the wall inside the transmitter room, wrapped in the survival blanket, the lunchbox on her lap. Nora stood beside Cal, watching him work, ready to hand him tools or hold wires or do whatever was needed. Boone stood at the window. The window overlooked the valley. From 3 stories up, he could see the entire town, or what the fog allowed. The orange glow of the checkpoints at both ends of Main Street, the scattered yellow squares of lit windows, the red taillights of trucks moving slowly through the residential streets, still searching, still hunting, even now. And then he saw something that made his stomach drop. Headlights. Not on Main Street, on the access road. 3 sets of headlights climbing the switchbacks below them, moving fast, their beams cutting through the fog in sharp white arcs. "Cal," he said, "I need 15 more minutes." "You've got 5. Cal looked up from the transmitter, saw Boone's face, didn't ask questions. He turned back to the equipment and his hands moved faster. Not panicked, not sloppy, but accelerated. The way a surgeon's hands accelerate when the bleeding starts and the clock becomes an enemy. Boone pulled his phone. "Dutch. Vehicles on the access road. 3. Moving fast. ETA 4, maybe 5 minutes." "Copy." Dutch's voice through the phone was flat. Combat flat. "Sawyer's got the ground floor. I'm on 3. What's the play?" "Delay. Don't engage unless they breach the building. We need time." "How much time?" "All of it." Boone closed the phone and turned to Nora. His eyes were different now. Not calm, not panicked, but operating at a level of intensity that civilian life rarely demands, and combat never lets you forget. The eyes of a man who has made the calculation between survival and sacrifice and found the line between them too thin to see. "The drive," he said. "Get it ready." Nora turned to Ember. The girl was already opening the lunchbox. Her fingers found the plastic-wrapped USB drive and held it up. Nora took it, peeled away the duct tape and plastic layers, and held the small black rectangle in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. 2 ounces, maybe 3. The weight of 6 lives. The weight of 3 years of running. The weight of a father's love converted into data and hidden inside a child's lunchbox. "Cal, can you play audio files from a USB drive through the transmitter?" "Not directly, but there's a media input on the auxiliary panel. A 1/4-inch jack. Standard audio. If the drive has playable files, I need something to read it and output sound." "A laptop." "A phone. Anything with a headphone jack and a USB adapter." Sawyer's voice came through Boone's phone, tight and sharp. "They're at the gate, 3 trucks. Mercer's in the lead vehicle. I can see him." Grant Mercer. Here. In person. Not sitting in a truck on Ridge Road directing operations by phone. Here, climbing the mountain, leading the assault himself. Nora understood instantly. Mercer couldn't trust this to his men. The evidence, the recordings, the drive, he needed to see them destroyed with his own eyes. He needed to hold the lunchbox in his own hands and know, with absolute certainty, that the last fragment of truth had been eliminated. This wasn't delegation. This was desperation wearing the mask of control. "Sawyer," Boone said, "fall back to the 2nd floor, block the stairwell. Do not engage first. If they come up, you make them earn every step." "With what? I've got a tire iron and harsh language." "Then use both." Boone turned to the room. Cal was elbow deep in the transmitter, his soldering iron glowing orange in the dark, connecting the battery pack to the transformer with alligator clips and stripped copper wire. Ember was pulling Sawyer's phone from the lunchbox. He'd given it to her hours ago in the basement to hold in case of emergency. An old Android with a cracked screen and 40% battery. The USB drive wouldn't connect directly, but Ember was already working on it, her fingers moving across the cracked screen with the desperate fluency of a generation that had grown up speaking technology as a first language. "The files are on the drive," she said. "Audio recordings, MP3 format. I need an OTG adapter to connect the USB to the phone." "I don't have an OTG adapter." "Then I need Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to transfer the files." She looked up. "There's no Wi-Fi up here." "No." The headlights outside had reached the parking lot. Through the window, Nora could see the trucks pulling to a stop in a line, their engines still running, their high beams flooding the building's facade with harsh white light that turned the broken windows into blank eyes. Doors opened. Men stepped out. 8, 10. Nora lost count. They moved with the organized precision of men who had done this before, spreading out along the building's perimeter, covering exits, establishing positions. And in the center of it all, standing in the glare of his own headlights with his charcoal overcoat buttoned to the throat, Grant Mercer looked up at the processing plant with the expression of a man surveying the final obstacle between himself and the erasure of everything that threatened him. "Cal," Boone said. "Status. Transformers connected. I'm calibrating the frequency. 3 minutes. We don't have 3 minutes. Then I'll do it in 2. A voice from outside, amplified. A bullhorn or a vehicle PA system. Mercer's voice, smooth, controlled, the voice of corporate presentations and county board meetings and private conversations in wood-paneled offices where deals were made and lives were ended with the same administrative efficiency. "I know you're in there." The words rolled across the parking lot and through the broken windows like smoke. "This doesn't have to end badly." The girl is confused. "The evidence you think you have is fabricated, manufactured by a disgruntled employee with a history of mental illness. No court will accept it. No prosecutor will touch it. You're risking your lives for nothing." Silence from inside the building. "I'm a reasonable man. I've been a friend to this community for 20 years. I've employed hundreds of people. I've invested in infrastructure, in schools, in public services. I don't want conflict. I want resolution." A pause. "Send the girl out. Give me the lunchbox, and everyone walks away. No charges, no consequences. You have my word." Boone stood at the window and looked down at Grant Mercer. The distance between them was maybe 60 feet, close enough to see the man's face in the headlight glare, the careful composition of his features, the absolute confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Your word," Boone said, quietly, to himself. Not loud enough for Mercer to hear, just loud enough for the room. Then he turned to Ember. "Is there any other way to get those files playing?" Ember stared at the phone, stared at the USB drive. Her face was white with pain and concentration and the particular fury of a child who has been underestimated by every adult she's ever met and has learned to weaponize that underestimation. "The notebook," she said. "What?" "My dad's notebook. He wrote down everything. Dates, names, amounts, descriptions of every recording. If I can't play the audio files, I can read them. Cal can broadcast my voice. I can read every word my father wrote and tell this town exactly what Grant Mercer did." The room went still. Nora looked at Boone. Boone looked at Cal. Cal's hands had stopped moving. His soldering iron hung suspended over the transformer, its tip glowing orange. "A live broadcast," Cal said. "Voice transmission. That's simpler. I just need a microphone patched into the transmitter. There's one built into the emergency system, a desk mic on the auxiliary panel." He set the soldering iron down and pulled the auxiliary panel open. Inside, mounted on a swivel arm, was a microphone the size of a fist, connected to the transmitter by a coiled cable. "It's here. If the capsule isn't corroded, it'll work." He tapped the microphone once. A dull thud resonated from the transmitter's monitor speaker. Low, distorted, but present. "It works." "Cal, how long?" 60 seconds, maybe less. I need to lock the frequency and open the broadcast channel. From below, the sound of breaking glass. Ground floor. Mercer's men were entering the building. Boone's phone buzzed. Sawyer's voice, barely a whisper. They're in. 6 men. Ground floor. Spreading out. 2 heading for the east stairwell. 2 for the west. 2 covering the main hall. Hold the west stairwell. Dutch, take the east. Copy. Both voices, simultaneous, carrying the specific frequency of men shifting from waiting into doing. Boone turned to Nora. Stay with her. Stay with Cal. No matter what happens below, you keep that broadcast going until every word in that notebook is on the air. Where are you going? He didn't answer. He was already moving. Out of the transmitter room, down the corridor, toward the east stairwell where Dutch was positioning himself at the top of the stairs with nothing between him and the men coming up except 3 flights of metal grating and the particular combination of mass, training, and absolute unwillingness to yield that had kept him alive through 3 deployments and 100 nights worse than this one. Nora watched Boone disappear into the corridor darkness. Then she turned back to the room. Cal was on his knees in front of the transmitter, making final connections. Ember was opening the leather notebook, flipping past the first pages to the entries dated 3 years ago, the pages where her father's handwriting grew tighter and more urgent as the truth he was recording grew more dangerous. From below, shouts, the clang of boots on metal stairs, a crash, pishke, something heavy, hitting something harder. Cal. 10 seconds. Cal. 5. A dial on the transmitter face swung from 0 to the center of a green band. A red light above it, the transmit indicator, flickered once, twice, then held steady. We're live, Cal said. His voice cracked on the second word. Every speaker in the valley, right now. Nora grabbed the microphone and held it in front of Ember. The girl's hands were shaking, the notebook trembling in her grip, the pages rustling like dry leaves. But her eyes were steady, fixed on her father's handwriting, fixed on the truth he had spent 2 years documenting and the rest of his life protecting. She leaned into the microphone. My name is Ember Hale. Her voice was thin, high, unmistakably a child's voice, and that was its power. Not authority, not anger, just the raw, unarmored sound of a 12-year-old girl speaking into the dark. My father's name is David Hale. He worked in the Ridgecrest mines for Grant Mercer's company. 3 years ago, 6 men died in a tunnel collapse that wasn't an accident. My father saw what happened. He wrote it all down. This is what he wrote. In the town below, in the diner and the hardware store and the meeting hall and the old company houses on the east side of Main Street, speakers that hadn't made a sound in years suddenly crackled to life. Static first, a harsh, electric hiss that made people jump in their chairs and look at their walls and their ceilings as if the building itself had started talking. And then a voice, a child's voice, coming from everywhere at once. Karen Braddock was standing in her kitchen when she heard it. She dropped the glass she was holding. Donna Kessler was sitting on her couch in the dark. She stood up. The men at the checkpoints looked at each other, looked at the speakers mounted on the telephone poles above their heads, looked at the PA system in their trucks, which had suddenly started broadcasting on a frequency they didn't control. And Grant Mercer, standing in the parking lot of the processing plant, heard his own name come out of a speaker mounted on the plant's exterior wall. A speaker that had been dead for years, connected to a system he thought was decommissioned, carrying the voice of the child he had spent 3 years hunting. His face changed. For the first time since he'd arrived in Ash Hollow, the mask slipped. Not completely. A man like Mercer doesn't lose control completely, because control is the architecture of his identity, and without it, he's just another aging man in an expensive coat standing in the rain. But the edges cracked. The pale eyes widened fractionally, the jaw tightened, and for one unguarded second the expression beneath the mask was visible. Fear. Shut it down, he said to the man beside him. His voice was no longer smooth. Find the transmitter and shut it down. Now! Inside the building, the sound of combat escalated. Dutch had barricaded the east stairwell with a section of conveyor housing he'd dragged across the third-floor landing. 400 pounds of rusted steel that turned the stairway into a choke point. 2 of Mercer's men were trying to push through it, Dutch stood behind it with the length of steel pipe and the patience of a man who had learned in Helmand province that the person who controls the doorway controls the fight. On the west side, Sawyer had taken a different approach. He'd pulled the metal grating off the second-floor landing, creating a 4-foot gap in the stairway that could only be crossed by jumping. The first man to try it landed badly, his ankle turning on the edge, and Sawyer was on him before he hit the ground, not with a weapon, but with the frantic, scrappy intensity of a kid from a bad neighborhood who'd never learned to fight clean because clean fighting was a privilege he'd never been offered. Ember's voice continued through the speakers. She read her father's entries in chronological order: dates, names, dollar amounts, the bribes paid to county inspectors, the falsified safety reports, the emails between Mercer's operations manager and the site foreman ordering the removal of support beams in Tunnel 7 to cut costs. The specific tonnage calculations that showed the tunnel was operating at 17% beyond its structural capacity on the day of the collapse. She read the names of the 6 men who died. Miguel Santos, age 34, father of 2. Kenneth Daw, age 28, recently married. Paul Whitfield, age 51, 3 months from retirement. James Achebe, age 40, volunteer firefighter. Thomas Renner, age 37, coached Little League Baseball. William Fong, age 43, supported his elderly mother. She read each name clearly, slowly, the way a person reads names that matter, not as data points but as human beings who woke up one morning, kissed their families goodbye, drove to work in a tunnel they trusted, and never came home. In the town below, the silence that followed each name was a different kind of silence than Ash Hollow was used to. This wasn't the silence of fear. This wasn't the silence of complicity. This was the silence of recognition, the specific, devastating quiet that falls over a community when it hears, spoken aloud for the first time, the truth it has spent years pretending not to know. Karen Braddock's phone rang. She answered it. The voice on the other end belonged to Tom Achebe, James Achebe's older brother, a man who'd spent 3 years demanding an investigation and being told there was nothing to investigate. "I'm hearing it," he said. His voice was breaking. "I'm hearing it right now." "I know." "Where is it coming from?" "The processing plant, the radio tower." "Is she safe? The girl, is she safe?" "I don't know. I'm going up there." "Tom, I'm going." The line went dead. Inside the transmitter room, Ember had reached the final entries in her father's notebook, the ones dated the week before his disappearance. The handwriting here was different, faster. The letters pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through in places. These weren't records. They were confessions. Last words written by a man who knew he was running out of time. She read, "This morning Lyle Dorsey told me the investigation was closed. He told me to forget what I saw. He told me that if I didn't forget, my daughter would be the one who paid for it. He said it with a smile. He said it the way you'd remind someone about a lunch appointment." She read, "I have made copies of everything. I have hidden the originals where Ember will find them. If I don't come back, she'll know what to do. She is 12 years old and she is braver than anyone I have ever met, and I am sorrier than I can say that bravery is what her life requires." Her voice broke on the last sentence. Not completely, not enough to stop her, not enough to silence the signal pushing through the antenna on the roof and into every receiver in the valley. But enough. Enough for every person listening to hear the crack in a child's voice and understand that what they were hearing was not a performance, but a wound. The door to the transmitter room burst open, not from the corridor, from a maintenance access at the back of the room that nobody had checked, a narrow service passage that connected the transmitter room to the building's mechanical space. 2 of Mercer's men came through it fast, flashlights blinding, boots loud on the concrete floor. The first man went straight for the transmitter. He grabbed the coaxial cable connecting the chassis to the antenna feed and pulled. The cable resisted, thick, heavy gauge, bolted to the chassis with a brass fitting, but he braced his foot against the wall and pulled harder. Cal threw himself at the man. 62 years old, 150 pounds, armed with nothing but a soldering iron and the desperate courage of a man who has spent his entire life being careful and has discovered, in the last 12 hours, that careful is just another word for complicit. He hit the man at chest level, and they both went down, crashing into the rack, dials spinning, the transmitter rocking on its mounts. The second man reached for Ember. Nora hit him with the battery pack. She swung it two-handed, 12 pounds of rechargeable lithium, dense and angular, connecting with the side of his head just above the ear. The impact traveled through her arms and into her shoulders, and she felt something in her wrist give way. A hot, electric snap that meant ligament or tendon. She didn't know which and didn't care. The man staggered, his flashlight clattering to the floor, his hands going to his head. Nora hit him again, this time in the ribs. He went down. Cal was underneath the first man, pinned. The soldering iron knocked from his hand. The man had his forearm across Cal's throat and was pressing down with methodical force. Cal's face was turning red, then purple. Ember threw the lunchbox. Not at the man, at the transmitter. The rusted metal box hit the chassis with a clang that resonated through the broadcast system and out of every speaker in the valley like a bell. The man looked up. Just for a second, just long enough. Boone came through the doorway. He moved differently now. The deliberate, measured control of the previous 24 hours was gone. What replaced it was something older and more dangerous, the fluid, economical violence of a man trained to enter rooms where people were trying to kill other people and make them stop. He crossed the distance to Cal's attacker in 3 steps, grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket, and pulled him off the old man with a force that sent him sliding across the concrete floor into the far wall. The man tried to get up. Boone put him down with a single strike, an open palm to the center of the chest that compressed the solar plexus and emptied the lungs. The man folded. Boone stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles scraped raw, blood running from a cut above his left eyebrow that he hadn't had 5 minutes ago. He looked at Nora, at Cal, who was gasping on the floor, hands at his throat, at Ember, who was sitting against the wall with her notebook open and the microphone still live. "Keep going," he said. The coaxial cable was still connected. The man hadn't managed to pull it free before Cal tackled him. The transmitter was still broadcasting. The red transmit light still glowed. Ember picked up the microphone. Her hands were shaking so badly the notebook pages blurred. She found her place. She kept reading. And then from the speakers, from every speaker in the building, in the parking lot, in the valley below, a sound that wasn't Ember's voice, a sound that came through the broadcast system on the same frequency, fed by a signal that Cal hadn't generated and couldn't explain. A man's voice. "Ember." One word, thin, broken, coming from somewhere inside the building's communication system. An intercom, a hard line, a secondary input that was still connected to the broadcast network. "Ember, it's Dad." The notebook fell from her hands. The microphone slipped. The broadcast went silent for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of dead air that felt like 3 centuries. "Dad?" she whispered. The voice came again. Weaker. Distorted by old wiring and distance and the particular quality of a voice that has spent 3 years in the kind of darkness that doesn't end at dawn. "I'm here. I'm in the building, lower level. They've been keeping me here, baby. In the tunnels beneath the plant." Nora grabbed Boone's arm. Her fingers dug into the leather hard enough to feel bone underneath. "He's alive," she said. "He's been here the whole time. Underneath us. Grant Mercer's been keeping him alive beneath the processing plant for 3 years." Boone's face went through something Nora would never forget. A sequence of expressions so rapid they were almost subliminal. Shock. Recognition. Rage. And then, beneath all of it, something that looked like the moment a man's understanding of his enemy shifts from dangerous to monstrous. Mercer hadn't killed David Hale because a dead man can't reveal where the evidence is hidden. He'd kept him alive, imprisoned beneath a building a mile above the town, in tunnels nobody knew existed, as insurance, a breathing, suffering leverage point, waiting for the day Mercer finally found the girl and the lunchbox, and needed the father to confirm that every copy had been destroyed. 3 years. In a hole beneath the ground. From outside, the sound of more vehicles, lights sweeping the parking lot, but also other sounds. Different engines, civilian vehicles, the slamming of doors, and the rising volume of voices that weren't professional and weren't organized but were angry with the specific fury of a community that has just heard the truth and can no longer pretend it didn't. Tom Achebe's truck. Karen Braddock's station wagon. Other vehicles Nora couldn't identify, climbing the access road in a ragged convoy of headlights and rage, and the long overdue arrival of a town that had finally stopped looking away. And beneath the building, in tunnels that led down into the mountain, a father who hadn't seen sunlight in 3 years was speaking to his daughter through a dead mining intercom, his voice carrying across the valley on a frequency that Grant Mercer had thought was silenced forever. Boone turned to Dutch, who had appeared in the doorway, bleeding from his forearm, his pipe still in his hand. "There are tunnels beneath this building," Boone said. "David Hale is in them." "Then we go get him." From outside, Mercer's amplified voice again, but different now, frayed. The smooth corporate cadence cracking at the seams, the vowels stretched by something that sounded, for the first time, like a man losing control of a situation he had designed to be unlosable. "Everyone stand down. This is private property. You are trespassing." Tom Achebe's voice cut through it, unamplified, raw. The voice of a man standing in a parking lot screaming his dead brother's name at the man who killed him. And in the transmitter room, Ember Hale held the microphone against her chest and listened to her father's breathing, alive, 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 coming through speakers that the whole valley could hear. The broadcast was still live. The truth was still transmitting. And somewhere beneath the concrete floor, a man who had spent 3 years choosing his daughter over his own survival was waiting in the dark for someone to open the door. Boone went down first. The access point was a rusted maintenance hatch in the floor of the processing plant's ground-level mechanical room, a steel plate bolted to a concrete frame hidden beneath a decade of debris and standing water. Dutch found it by following the intercom wiring through the walls, tracing the cables from the transmitter room down 3 flights of stairs and along the mechanical corridor until they disappeared into the floor at a junction box that still had power running through it. Sawyer pried the bolts with a wrench from Cal's tool bag. 4 bolts, each one screaming against corrosion. The sound echoed through the empty building like something being torn open from the inside. The hatch lifted. Below it, a ladder descended into blackness. Real blackness. The kind that has weight and texture and smells like damp earth and concrete and something else, something human, the specific staleness of air that has been breathed and rebreathed in a closed space for longer than a body should endure. Boone looked at Dutch. Dutch nodded once. Boone put his penlight between his teeth and went down. The ladder dropped 12 feet into a corridor that was narrower than the mining tunnels Nora had described. 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall, poured concrete walls sweating with moisture. It wasn't a mine shaft. It was something built deliberately, recently, within the last decade. Electrical conduit ran along the ceiling, a single string of caged work lights, half of them dead, the rest casting a weak yellow glow that barely pushed back the darkness, stretched down the corridor in both directions. Boone moved left, toward the sound of breathing he could hear through the wall. The corridor turned once, then opened into a wider space. A room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with the same poured concrete walls and a drain in the floor. A cot. A bucket. A small table with a lamp that wasn't lit. And sitting on the floor against the far wall, his back against the concrete, his knees drawn up to his chest in a posture that was identical to the way his daughter had sat beneath a bench in the rain 24 hours ago, was David Hale. He was thin, not malnourished. Someone had been feeding him, keeping him functional, maintaining the asset, but the kind of thin that comes from years without sunlight, without movement, without the basic physical engagement that keeps a human body from consuming itself. His hair was long, matted, hanging past his jaw. His beard was untrimmed and streaked with gray that hadn't been there 3 years ago. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, the fingers slightly curled, and even in the dim light Boone could see the scars on his wrists. Not self-inflicted, but the marks of restraints applied and removed and applied again over months and years. His eyes were open. They were the same color as embers, dark brown, almost black, but the fierceness that burned in his daughter's eyes had been replaced by something else. A patience that wasn't peace, an endurance that wasn't acceptance. The specific, Terrible stillness of a man who had survived by reducing himself to a single purpose. Don't tell them where she is. David Hale, Boone said. The man blinked, slowly, as if the sound of a new voice was something his nervous system needed time to process. Who are you? His voice was the same voice that had come through the intercom, thin, cracked, carrying the dust of 3 years underground. But in person it was quieter, smaller. The voice of a man who had spent 1,000 days talking only to himself and had forgotten the volume required for conversation. My name's Boone. I'm here with your daughter. David's hands clenched, the fingers curled inward, nails pressing into palms, and something moved across his face. Something that had been locked behind a door for so long that its emergence was almost violent. Not joy, not relief. Something before those things. Something more fundamental. The recognition that hope, the thing he'd been surviving on, the thing he'd been told 1,000 times was pointless, had been right all along. She's alive, he said. She's alive. She's upstairs. She just broadcast everything in your notebook across the entire valley. David closed his eyes. His head tipped back against the concrete wall and his chest heaved once. A single convulsive inhale that sounded like a man surfacing after being held underwater. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just air. Just the raw, ragged act of breathing through a grief that had suddenly been converted into something else. Something his body didn't have the muscle memory to express because 3 years in a concrete room had stripped away every physical language except endurance. Can you walk? Boone asked. David opened his eyes, looked down at his legs, moved them experimentally, slowly, the way a man moves limbs he's not entirely sure still belong to him. I think so. Then let's go meet your kid. Boone helped him up. David's hand on his forearm was light, the grip of a man who'd lost the habit of leaning on anyone, but it tightened as he found his balance, his legs trembling beneath him, his bare feet on cold concrete. Boone let him set the pace. Down the corridor, to the ladder, up 12 rungs, each one a negotiation between will and atrophied muscle. Dutch was waiting at the top. He reached down, grabbed David's forearm, and pulled him up through the hatch with one smooth motion. David stood in the mechanical room, swaying slightly, blinking against the darkness that was somehow brighter than anything he'd seen in 3 years because it was real darkness, open darkness, darkness with air moving through it and the smell of rain and the distant sound of voices. They brought him up through the building, through the corridor, past the stairwell where Sawyer was sitting on the top step with a split lip and a tire iron across his knees, and the expression of a man who had just discovered something about himself he hadn't known before. Past the offices with their water-stained walls, to the transmitter room. Ember saw him before he saw her. She was sitting against the wall where Nora had placed her, the survival blanket around her shoulders, the leather notebook on the floor beside her. The microphone was still live. Cal was sitting beside the transmitter, his hand on his throat where the bruises were already forming, watching the transmit indicator hold steady. Ember made a sound, not a word, not a scream, something between a gasp and a sob that came from a place inside her that language couldn't reach. She tried to stand. Her broken leg buckled immediately and she went down on one knee, and Nora caught her before she hit the floor. David was already there. He crossed the room in 4 steps, unsteady, lurching, his body operating on something beyond muscle because muscle had been taken from him years ago. He dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, and his hands went to her face, cupping her cheeks, his fingers trembling against her skin as if he needed to touch her to confirm she was made of something solid, real, present. "Baby," he said. The word broke in the middle. Ember's hands found his wrists. She held them the way she'd held the lunchbox. With everything she had, every ounce of strength and desperation and love and rage compressed into 10 fingers locked around her father's skin. She didn't speak, neither did he. They just stayed there, on the floor of a room full of strangers, holding on to each other with the silent ferocity of 2 people who had survived the same catastrophe from opposite sides of a wall and had finally, impossibly, found the door. Nora turned away. Not because the moment was private. It was, but that wasn't why. She turned away because the thing happening on the floor of the transmitter room was so large, so undeniable, so absolutely real that looking at it directly felt like staring into something too bright for ordinary vision. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes and felt the tears come. Not for Ember, not for David, but for something she couldn't name. Something that had been dead inside her for 3 years and was, against every expectation, still breathing. Boone stood in the doorway. He didn't enter the room. He watched from the threshold with his arms at his sides, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has spent his adult life building walls to keep the world at a safe distance and has just been reminded why walls are not the same thing as safety. Dutch appeared behind him, put a hand on his shoulder, didn't say anything. Just the weight of a palm against leather. A contact that said everything that two men who'd served together could say without words. I see it. I see you seeing it. We did this. Outside, the situation had changed. The parking lot of the processing plant was no longer Grant Mercer's staging ground. It was something else entirely. In the 20 minutes since Ember's broadcast had begun, the access road had filled with civilian vehicles. Trucks, sedans, station wagons, a minivan with a cracked windshield, and a bumper sticker that read Ash Hollow Miners Association. Headlights pointed in every direction, crisscrossing the fog like searchlights at a premiere nobody had planned. Tom Achebe was standing at the gate with 6 men behind him. Former miners. Sons and brothers of former miners. Men who had listened to Ember read the names of the dead and had felt something shift inside them. A tectonic movement, slow and deep, the kind of shift that breaks surfaces. Karen Braddock was on her phone talking to a dispatcher at the state police barracks in Cedar Falls, repeating the same sentence over and over. There is a child in danger, and your county sheriff is complicit. Donna Kessler was there. She hadn't called Mercer. She hadn't taken the $50,000. She was sitting in her car with the engine running and her 2 children asleep in the back seat, and her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were the same white as the fog. And she was crying. Not from fear, but from the specific, devastating relief of a person who came within inches of becoming someone they couldn't live with, and pulled back at the last possible second. Grant Mercer stood beside his lead truck, alone. His men had peeled away from him one by one as the townspeople arrived, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, practical withdrawal of employees who have calculated the trajectory of events and determined that the paychecks will stop before the consequences do. 2 of them had driven away without a word. 3 others were sitting in their trucks with the doors locked, watching. The rest had simply faded into the fog, professionals evaporating from a contract that no longer had a future. Mercer himself had not moved. He stood in the headlight glare with his charcoal overcoat buttoned to the throat, his hands in his pockets, his face a controlled composition of nothing. The absolute blankness of a man whose architecture of power is collapsing around him and whose only remaining strategy is to refuse to acknowledge the collapse. His pale eyes moved across the crowd, the vehicles, the building, the antenna tower still transmitting his destruction across the valley. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't bargain. The time for those tools had passed. At 8:47 p.m., the state police arrived. 4 cruisers, rolling up the access road with their lights on and their sirens off. They parked in a line at the edge of the parking lot, and 8 troopers stepped out with the methodical calm of officers arriving at a scene that has already been contained by the people who lived through it. The senior trooper, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the bearing of someone who had stopped being surprised by corruption 2 decades ago, walked directly to Grant Mercer. She didn't ask his name. She didn't introduce herself. She simply stood in front of him and said, "Mr. Mercer, we've received a complaint involving false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and involvement in 6 wrongful deaths. You're going to come with us." Mercer looked at her. The blankness on his face held for one more second. Then something cracked behind it. Not remorse, not fear, but the recognition that the machine he'd spent 20 years building had finally encountered the one variable it couldn't absorb. A child with a lunchbox in a town that chose to listen. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He placed his hands on the hood of the trooper's cruiser and let himself be searched and handcuffed with the mechanical compliance of a man who has already begun calculating his legal defense and will continue calculating it for the rest of his life. 3 of his remaining associates were arrested in the parking lot. 2 more were picked up at the highway checkpoint within the hour. Lyle Dorsey, the site manager who had ordered the crew into Tunnel 7, was arrested at his home in Ridgecrest at 11 p.m., still wearing his pajamas, the expression on his face suggesting he had been expecting this knock for 3 years. David Hale was carried down the mountain by Dutch and Boone, seated in the back of Karen Braddock's station wagon, with Ember pressed against his side and the lunchbox between them. The ambulance from Cedar Falls met them at the bottom of the access road. 2 paramedics, a stretcher, an oxygen mask that David wore for 30 seconds before pulling it off because the open air, cold, wet, tasting of pine and diesel and the mineral bite of mountain fog, was more oxygen than his lungs knew what to do with. They took him and Ember to Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center, separate rooms, same floor. Nora rode in the ambulance with Ember, holding the girl's hand while the paramedic started an IV and stabilized the leg for transport. Ember didn't speak during the ride. She lay on the stretcher with her eyes open, staring at the ambulance ceiling, and every few seconds her fingers would tighten around Nora's hand. A pulse, a check, a question asked without words. "Are you still here?" Every time Nora squeezed back. "Still here." The surgery on Ember's leg happened the next morning. A tibial fracture, set with 2 pins and a fiberglass cast that the orthopedic surgeon said would need to stay on for 8 weeks. She'd walk again. She'd run again. The surgeon said this with the professional optimism of a man delivering good news, apparently unaware that the 12-year-old girl in his operating room had spent 3 years walking and running on borrowed time, and that the promise of doing it again was not a medical outcome, but a second life. David Hale was treated for severe vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, chronic dehydration, and the particular constellation of psychological damage that results from prolonged solitary confinement. A team of specialists cycled through his room for 3 days, running tests, asking questions, documenting injuries. He answered everything with the same quiet patience he'd used to survive the underground, cooperating fully, speaking when spoken to, revealing everything without emphasis or self-pity. But when Ember was wheeled into his room after her surgery, her leg elevated, her hair washed for the first time in days, wearing a hospital gown that was 3 sizes too big, he wept. Not silently, not with dignity. He wept the way a person weeps when the dam breaks and there is no longer any reason to hold the water back because the flood isn't destruction anymore. It's release. Nora stood in the hallway outside the room and watched through the glass partition. She'd been awake for 42 hours. Her wrist was in a brace, torn ligament, the ER doctor had said, 3 to 6 weeks of immobilization. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her body running on the fumes of adrenaline that had burned out hours ago and left nothing but a low, persistent hum of exhaustion that lived in her bones. Boone found her there. He walked down the corridor with 2 paper cups of vending machine coffee, the kind of coffee that tastes like hot water filtered through regret, and handed her one without comment. He leaned against the wall beside her, his own injuries catalogued and dismissed. 4 stitches above his left eyebrow, bruised ribs, scraped knuckles wrapped in white gauze that was already showing spots of pink. They stood in silence for a while. The hospital hummed around them. The beeping of monitors, the murmur of nurses, the squeak of shoes on polished floors, sounds of a world that was still functioning, still ordinary, still turning despite everything that had happened on the mountain above Ash Hollow. "Dutch wants to know if you need a ride back," Boone said. "Back where?" "The diner," Nora laughed. It surprised her. The sound coming out of her throat before she could stop it, raw and short, and carrying the specific pitch of a woman who has just realized that the life she left behind 24 hours ago is still there, waiting for her, unchanged, with its dirty coffee mugs and its flickering neon sign and its rented room above the hardware store. "The diner," she repeated. "Yeah, I guess someone should open it." Boone took a sip of his coffee, made a face, took another sip anyway. "For what it's worth," he said, "you should know that what happened up there, the battery pack, the transmitter, the tunnels, none of it would have worked without you. It wouldn't have worked without Cal, or Karen, or Tom Achabe. No, it wouldn't. He paused. But they showed up because you did. You were the first one who didn't look away. Nora stared at the coffee in her hand. The surface trembled with the micro vibrations of her own exhaustion. Ember said the same thing, she said, under the bench. She said I didn't look away. She was right. I almost did. Nora's voice dropped. Quiet, honest. The specific frequency of a confession made to someone who has earned it. When Mercer walked into the diner and put that $100 on the counter and told me she was unreliable, told me bringing her back was the responsible thing, I almost believed him. For about 10 seconds, I almost convinced myself that handing her over was the right thing to do because it was the easy thing to do, and I'd spent 3 years learning how to do the easy thing. 10 seconds isn't almost. 10 seconds is a decision. What do you mean? I mean you had 10 seconds of doubt and then you chose. That's not weakness. That's how every hard choice works. You feel the pull toward the wrong thing and then you go the other way. The pull doesn't disqualify you, the direction does. Nora looked at him. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp against the hospital corridor's fluorescent light, the stitches above his eyebrow forming a dark line that intersected with the older scar on his jaw. He looked tired. Not the performative tiredness of a man seeking sympathy, but the bone-deep depletion of someone who has been running on something other than sleep for so long that stopping feels like falling. What happens to the Steel Reapers now? She asked. We go back to Iron Creek, open the shop, fix bikes, run the boxing program. A pause. Same as before. Same as before? We don't do this for credit. We don't do it for recognition. We do it because somebody has to, and the people who are supposed to won't. He finished his coffee, crushed the paper cup, and dropped it in the trash bin beside the elevator. That's not a philosophy, it's just a fact. He pushed off the wall and stood in front of her. For a moment he looked like he was going to say something else, something that existed in the space between two people who had gone through something together that neither of them fully understood yet. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his cut and pulled out a card. Not a business card, just a piece of paper with a phone number written in pencil. If you need anything, he said, or if she does. Nora took the card, held it carefully, the way you hold something you know you're going to keep. Boone. He stopped. Thank you. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he nodded once. The same nod she'd seen on Main Street, through the rain, through the window, across the impossible distance between a man who'd lost everything and a woman who'd stopped believing anything was worth keeping. A nod that said nothing and everything. A nod that was the entire vocabulary of a man who'd been trained to communicate in actions and had never found a reason to learn any other language. Then he walked down the corridor. His boots were silent on the polished floor. At the elevator, Dutch and Sawyer were waiting. Dutch had his arm in a sling, a deep laceration from the stairwell fight, stitched and bandaged, carried with the casual indifference of a man who considered intact limbs a bonus rather than a requirement. Sawyer was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, and a bruise the color of a thundercloud spread across the left side of his jaw. They didn't speak. The elevator doors opened. The three of them stepped inside. Boone turned and looked back down the corridor at Nora one last time. The doors closed. 6 weeks later, the diner reopened. Not as Dale's. The sign was new, hand-painted by Tom Achebe's teenage daughter on a piece of reclaimed barnwood, hung above the door on chains that Dutch had welded himself during a weekend trip from Iron Creek that he described as passing through despite the fact that Iron Creek was 60 miles in the opposite direction of anywhere. The sign read, Quinn's. Nora had bought the building with money she didn't have, using a loan co-signed by Cal Whitman, who had put up his apartment as collateral with the calm certainty of a man who had discovered, at 62, that risk is not the opposite of safety, but the prerequisite for it. The interior was the same counter, the same stools, the same pie case with the clock above it that still ran 3 minutes slow. But the walls had been repainted. The booths had been reupholstered in dark red vinyl that Karen Braddock had sourced from a warehouse in Cedar Falls. The coffee machine was new, a commercial-grade unit that produced coffee so superior to the old one that regulars complained it didn't taste right, which Nora took as a compliment. The bench outside remained. Nobody moved it. Nobody painted it. The peeling green surface and the one short leg and the brass plaque that Cal had commissioned from a metal worker in Iron Creek, all of it stayed exactly as it was. The plaque read, "Sometimes the bravest words are whispered." On the morning of the reopening, Ember sat at the counter with her cast propped on the adjacent stool, eating pancakes with a focus and determination that suggested the pancakes owed her money. Her father sat beside her, drinking coffee, his hands wrapped around the mug the same way Nora's hands had wrapped around a mug on the night everything started. Not for warmth, but for something to hold on to. David Hale was different now. Not recovered. Recovery from 3 years underground was a project measured in decades, not weeks, but present. He'd gained weight, his hair was cut short. He spoke more, though never loudly, and sometimes in the middle of a sentence he'd stop and look around the room, as if confirming that the walls were still open, and the ceiling was still high, and the door was still unlocked. Small calibrations, tiny tests conducted by a nervous system that was still learning to trust open space. He'd moved into a rental house on the east side of town, a small 2-bedroom that Karen Braddock had found for him, furnished by donations from neighbors who left things on the porch without knocking, because they understood that a man who'd spent 3 years behind a locked door might need some time before he was comfortable with visitors. Nora had filed for temporary guardianship of Ember the day after the hospital discharge. David had signed the papers himself, not because he couldn't care for his daughter, but because he knew, with the hard-won wisdom of a man who had stared at his own limitations for 1,000 days, that he needed time to rebuild himself before he could be what she needed. Ember split her nights between the two of them, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and weekends with her father. The rest with Nora, in the apartment above the hardware store that Cal had renovated with new drywall and a window that faced east, so the morning sun reached Ember's bed before her alarm went off. The custody arrangement wasn't legal, it wasn't official. It was the kind of arrangement that exists in small towns where the law is too slow, and the need is too immediate, held together by handshake agreements and the specific trust that forms between people who have carried each other through darkness. On the morning of the reopening, the Steel Reapers came. Not the whole club. Boone, Dutch, Sawyer, and 4 others, Mace, Pike, Torres, and Hannah, the crew who'd been turned back at the checkpoint and had spent the rest of that night in Iron Creek listening to the broadcast on a scanner radio and breaking things in the shop out of frustration. They rode up Route 11 in formation, a sound that Ash Hollow had learned to recognize not with fear, but with something closer to reassurance, the way a town near the coast learns to recognize the sound of the lighthouse horn. They parked in a line in front of the diner. 7 bikes. Chrome catching the morning light. Engines cutting one by one until the street was quiet again. Boone walked in first. He looked at the new sign, looked at the new paint, looked at the counter where Ember was sitting with pancake syrup on her chin and the cast on her leg covered in signatures and drawings from kids at the school she'd started attending 3 weeks ago. "Nice place," he said. "Same place," Nora said. "Different name." "Better name." She poured him coffee. He sat at the counter beside Ember, who looked up at him with an expression that had evolved over 6 weeks from wary evaluation to something warmer, something that existed in the territory between respect and affection and hadn't yet been given a name because 12-year-old girls don't name things like that. They just feel them and let the names come later. "How's the leg?" Boone asked. "Itchy." "That means it's healing." "That's what everyone says. It doesn't make it less itchy." Dutch came in behind Boone and made directly for the kitchen, where he began inspecting the new coffee machine with the same intense focus he applied to combat medicine and motorcycle engines. 2 fingers on the steam wand, 1 eye on the pressure gauge, the entire operation conducted with the gravity of a man diffusing a device. Sawyer sat in a booth by the window and ordered everything on the menu. The waitress, a new hire, a college student from Cedar Falls named Rhea, who had no idea who these men were or why they mattered, brought him plate after plate while he ate with the single-minded intensity of a 25-year-old who had recently discovered that near-death experiences make food taste better. The diner filled. Not just bikers, everyone. Karen Braddock and her children. Tom Achebe with his wife. Cal Whitman, who sat in his usual spot by the register and drank his usual decaf and watched the room with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 31 years delivering other people's mail and had finally, in the last month of his 62nd year, delivered something that mattered. Donna Kessler came in at 9. She stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain, her eyes finding Nora behind the counter. The two women looked at each other. Neither spoke. Then Nora poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter at the empty stool beside David Hale. Donna sat down, wrapped her hands around the mug, stared at the surface of the coffee as if it contained the answer to a question she'd been asking herself for 6 weeks. "I almost called," she said. To no one in particular. To everyone. "I know," Nora said. "I didn't." "I know that too." Donna nodded, lifted the mug, drank. And that was it. No absolution, no dramatic forgiveness, just coffee and the specific fragile understanding that people are not the worst thing they almost did. Outside, the sun cleared the eastern ridge and fell across Main Street in long gold bars that turned the wet pavement into mirrors. The fog had lifted for the first time in weeks, and the mountains surrounding Ash Hollow were visible. All of them, the full circle of peaks and ridges that had once felt like walls and now looked like what they were. The edges of a valley that had always been beautiful and had simply forgotten to notice. Boone finished his coffee, set the mug down, looked at Nora. "We should get going." "Already?" "Shop doesn't run itself. And Mesa's got a custom build due Friday that he hasn't started because he spent the last 3 days arguing with a parts distributor about a carburetor that doesn't exist." Nora smiled. It was small, quick, the kind of smile she'd forgotten she knew how to make. Not the performative courtesy smile of a waitress serving strangers, but the real thing, involuntary, produced by the specific warmth of standing in a room full of people who had earned each other's presence. "Come back any time," she said. "We will." He said it simply, without emphasis, the way a person states a fact that doesn't require decoration because the truth of it is self-evident. The Steel Reapers left the way they arrived. Single file through the door, leather and boots, and the quiet nods of men who communicate more efficiently in silence than most people communicate in conversation. Engines started one by one. The sound-filled Main Street rolled off the buildings, echoed against the mountains, and then faded as they rode south toward Route 11, toward Iron Creek, toward the machine shop and the boxing program, and the ordinary life that existed on the other side of the extraordinary thing they'd done. Nora watched them go from the diner window. Beside her, Ember stood on one leg with her crutch tucked under her arm and her face pressed against the glass, watching the last bike disappear around the bend at the south end of town. "They'll come back," Ember said. Not a question. "Yeah," Nora said. "They will." David Hale sat at the counter behind them, his coffee growing cold, his eyes on his daughter's reflection in the window glass. He didn't speak. He'd learned in 3 years underground that some moments are too complete for language, that sometimes the most accurate thing a person can do is sit quietly and let the world be what it is, imperfect, damaged, scarred in places that will never fully heal, but lit, finally, by a light that nobody can take away. Outside, the bench sat in the morning sun, the peeling green paint, the one short leg, the brass plaque catching the light. A woman walking her dog paused beside it, read the plaque, and sat down. She didn't know the story. She didn't know about the girl, or the rain, or the whisper that had started everything. She just saw a bench in the sun and thought it looked like a good place to rest. And it was. The streets of Ash Hollow were quiet, not the old quiet, the suffocating, complicit silence of a town that had learned to swallow its own voice. This was different. This was the quiet of a place that had spoken and been heard and had discovered that the silence on the other side of truth sounds nothing like the silence that came before it. In the diner, the coffee machine hissed. Plates clinked. Someone laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded. The kind that fills a room without trying. Nora Quinn wiped the counter, poured another cup, looked at the girl sitting at her counter, the man beside her, the room full of people who had chosen, in the end, to stop looking away. She thought about the night it started. The rain. The bench. The whisper. "Please don't tell him I'm here." She hadn't told, and the town that had been silent for years had found, in the voice of a 12-year-old girl broadcasting through a dead man's radio tower, the sound it had been missing all along. Its own.